He was Zack Novita, the last surviving member of Noble House Novita, the chosen of the angels. And he had won. He honestly never thought he would win. He wanted to win, of course. He wanted to know what kind of wonders the world beyond this month had in store for him. He wanted to rebuild his house and make his caretaker pay for what he had done to him. He wanted to have friends and lovers that would never forget him. But this wish, it was merely a wistful dream, flickering in the back of his mind and refusing to die. He didn't seriously consider it, and not just because of the stupid angel contract and its impossible conditions. The truth was, he'd kind of given up a long time ago. He had tried to beat the invasion so many times, attempt after attempt, idea after idea, until eventually, he became convinced this was his fate. To stay there forever, in an endlessly looping world. All this power and knowledge, all the revelations about his past life, all the insights into people around him, the time loop dangled these things over his head, but it was all meaningless because he couldn't get out. Stopping the invasion of Scioria was the key. He knew this. Somehow, deep down in his soul, he knew this. But he couldn't do it, no matter how many times he tried. It was fine while he was still learning things, becoming a better mage, and brimming with ideas, but slowly, he started to slow down. He had learned everything he possibly could about the invaders themselves. Advancing his magic became harder. And harder, each new spell or training method giving ever smaller improvements. His inspiration began to dry out. And yet he still couldn't get out. He was as good as he realistically would ever be, and yet it wasn't enough to stop the invasion. His best wasn't enough. That's when he realized he wouldn't be getting out. He wouldn't ever be getting out. And then he met Zorian. His friend was alright. He scared him with his behavior from time to time, and he wished he was easier to talk to and more fun to hang out with, but hey. You can't have everything. More importantly, he was driven. He had that spark to keep going that had mostly died in Zack a long time ago. He had ideas that would have never even occurred to Zack, and methods that were alien to Zack's way of thinking. It was new and refreshing, and it reignited that spark of hope in him that refused to fully die. A long time ago, when Zack had only begun figuring out the time loop and his skills were still growing, his pride would have bristled at the idea of just letting his new friend take the lead in how they should proceed with their escape plan or go about honing their skills. Alas, that was a long time ago. By the time Zack met Zorian, the time loop had already grounded him, and he was entirely content to simply act as support. He stepped aside and let Zorian plan their escape and set their short-term goals, trusting his new friend to get them out of their looping nightmare and simply steering him away from his more dubious choices. In the end, that path had led him here, locked in a deadly battle against his other time-traveling companion Red Robe. Or Jornak. Whatever. He would always be Red Robe to Zack, in all honesty. Even now he was wearing that stupid red robe of his to hide his appearance. He had trapped Zack in some kind of strange dimensional labyrinth, at first a mirror image of the city covered in thick mist that severely limited Zack's vision while allowing Red Robe to move around in some strange manner that Zack found hard to understand at first. Red Robe clearly thought of him as some kind of dumb brute that wouldn't be able to deal with this kind of environment, but Zack hadn't spent all those years in the time loop for nothing, and his knowledge of dimensionalism had reached incredible heights while he had been working with Zorian and others to create a viable escape route into the real world. Red Robe bragged a lot about this misty labyrinth world while he and Zack fought. An attempt to demoralize him, maybe? Maybe he couldn't see all that well in there either, and wanted Zack to verbally respond so he could lock onto his position more securely. In any case, Red Robe said this misty world was primordial magic granted to him by Panicseth. A place isolated from the real world, impossible to escape. Place largely removed from the real world, impossible to escape. Wasn't that almost exactly the description of the time loop? Hadn't Zack helped Zorian learn how to punch a hole through it so he could escape? Red Robe thought Zack was a dumb brute, but Zack had figured his little trick out within a minute of arriving there. Just like the time loop was centered on Panicseth, this world of mists was centered around Red Robe. There was no point looking for an exit in the environment around them. The exit was Red Robe. The fight between them lasted a while, but eventually Zack managed to maneuver things in the right direction. He had to let one of Red Robe's kinetic spells clip him in the leg, leaving him limping, but it was of no importance. It was a relatively light wound, and he had drunk a potion of regeneration before the battle. His leg would be fine soon enough. What was important was that he used the opportunity to hit Red Robe with a dimensional spell designed specifically to punch holes in these kind of prisons. It was literally one of a kind, a product of their intense research near the end of the time loop, and Red Robe clearly had no idea how to deal with it. Zack had expected to punch a literal hole in the misty world, but it turned out that Red Robe's little creation was incomparable to that of Panicseth, even if they had the same origin. The moment it was forcibly punctured, the mist started to thin and fade, until the entire world quietly disappeared at some point, shunting them back to the real world. They came back just in time to see Zorian take out Quatakikl. It filled Zack with complex feelings to see Zorian best his oldest enemy so seemingly easily. He knew that a lot of work and preparation went into this victory, and that it was not nearly as easy as it looked, but it still made him a little jealous. Just a little bit. Red Robe, on the other hand, was just mad. He attacked Zack with increased ferocity to vent his frustration, and Zack matched it without any reservations. Black swords made out of dimensional forces slashed at Jornak, cutting deep gouges as he dodged out of the way. Tiny incandescent suns zipped around with the speed and agility of a swallow, the ground exploded into stone spears that then exploded into thousands of needle-like shards, rays of electrified light surged forward while evading obstacles like immaterial snakes, and the air itself was whipped into a miniature tornado centered on Zack. He may have failed in a lot of areas of his life, but if there was one thing Zack Novita felt supremely confident in, that was his combat skills. He was good at fighting, and he loved doing it. It rejuvenated him to fight worthy opponents, made him feel alive. He looked at his opponent, his red robe long since tattered, and met the man's eyes, trying to jog his memory. To remember the time they apparently met and became friends. Alas, nothing came to his mind. There was no memory, no instinctive knowledge, not even a feeling of déjà vu. The man was a complete stranger. Red Robe. Jornak. The man who apparently betrayed him and tampered with his mind, leaving him even more lost inside the time loop than he already was. Zack was angry at the man for what he had done, but if he was honest with himself, not that angry. He didn't actually remember the betrayal, and he was always a relatively easygoing guy. Even so, tracking the man down and making him pay for what he had done had been the driving force of his life for a while now. He didn't think it was the effect of any magical compulsion or anything, he just found hating the man to be convenient. Invigorating. Focusing on Red Robe and how he messed him up gave Zack a goal in life that he had lacked for so long, so how he could not go after him. Plus, the man was clearly a total nutcase. He wasn't an empath like Zorian, but he didn't need to be one to get a read on the guy. Even more than Zack himself, he was dead inside. The next round of Continental Wars was going to be bad enough without a guy like this throwing oil into the fire. He had to go. Then Zorian made O'Gange go away. He did it in such a hilarious way, too. Except for the part where he gave up the Imperial Orb to make it happen, that part was honestly awful. Hadn't they agreed the orb would go to him after the month was over, since he got Princess? The asshole had no right to give it away. Hell, he didn't even try to negotiate with the stupid lizard. Oh well. Truthfully, the idea he would get to enjoy the Imperial Orb, or anything else for that matter, was just a wistful dream. The angel contract hung like a sword above his head, ready to strike. Its terms were impossible to fulfill. No matter what happened, Zack only had a little time left. Or so he thought at the time, anyway. Without warning, Zorian teleported near the site of Zack's battle with Red Robe. Zack remembered feeling a flash of anger in response, even if he stayed quiet. It made sense for Zorian to help bring down Red Robe as quickly as possible, but this was the final stretch of the battle and Zack was enjoying himself. This was the last fun thing he was ever going to do in his life. Did Zorian really have to take it away from him? What happened next shocked him completely. Without saying anything, Zorian simply lunged at Red Robe, rapidly entering melee range with the man while charging some kind of spell Zack didn't recognize. Though angry, exhausted, and focused on Zack, Red Robe reacted quickly. He instantly spun to the side to face this new opponent, drawing a knife from his belt in a smooth, practiced motion. No, it was not just a knife, Zack realized. It was the Imperial dagger. Red Robe must have quietly stolen it from the royal vaults at some point. It wasn't that surprising. The man must have gotten quite proficient at it over the restarts, but he thought the dagger wasn't that useful. Red Robe's expression alone told Zack that he had thought wrong. An expression of pure glee and hate shone on the man's face, as if he hoped this very thing would happen and couldn't believe Zorian was stupid enough to grant him this opportunity. Zack hastily launched a fast-moving spell at the two, trying to blast them apart from each other, but he wasn't fast enough. The dagger shone with a faint purple light as Red Robe thrust it forward toward Zorian's face. Zorian did nothing to dodge or shield himself with magic, but that protective cube he made quietly interposed itself in the path of the knife. Zorian's faith in his grand creation proved to be severely misplaced, however. As great as his skills at artificing were, the dagger was a genuine divine artifact. It sliced straight through the cube like it was made of paper and stabbed forward, impaling Zorian straight through the neck. Simultaneously, Zorian's glowing hand slammed straight into Red Robe's chest, blowing a massive hole straight through his chest and causing some kind of faint blue waves to resonate across the man's entire body. And then Zorian's damaged defense cube detonated in a massive explosion that not only blew Zorian and Red Robe away from each other like rag dolls, but also flung Zack back into the nearby building. Zack wasn't really hurt. It wasn't the first time he was flung back into a wall. He cushioned his impact with the wall with a quick magic, expertly landing on his feet. He quickly scanned the area and found Zorian lying on his back some distance away. He rushed towards the boy to provide aid but stopped when he got close enough to really see him. He wasn't moving. His eyes, blank and glassy, remained open. His chest didn't move. And the Imperial dagger was still stuck up to the hilt in his neck, and his whole body was full of serrated metal bits sticking out his skin, the remains of his defense device driven deep into his flesh by the force of the explosion. He stared at his friend for a few seconds, overcome in disbelief, before walking forwards. He cast a quick diagnostic spell and slowly, hesitantly placed his hand on him. He wasn't that great with healing magic, but this was one of the simplest spells in that field and he had an excellent grasp on it. The spell told him what he already knew, but didn't want to accept. Zorian was dead. No, he whispered despondently. No. Zorian, you stupid, 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 why? Why would you do something so dash? Because this was deliberate. What don't you understand? He chose to die so you could live. The thought bubbled up to his mind suddenly, unpleasant and uninvited. It hit him like a punch in the face. He wouldn't, Zack mumbled to himself. He's too selfish, he said so himself. He has friends, a family, a little sister that needs him, a whole bunch of girls that want to get in his pants. He took a deep breath and forcefully calmed himself. He had to check something. He got up to his feet and ran up to where Red Robe was also laying on the ground, motionless. The man was also dead, unsurprisingly. Not only did Zorian's last attack completely destroy his heart and chest, the blue wave that accompanied the attack also did something. Ripped his soul out of his body, maybe. His medical magic was too rudimentary to figure it out, but the man was definitely dead. He swallowed heavily and then got up again. He started to search for other people. Everyone seemed to be unconscious, Zack soon realized. They were lying all over the place on the streets, in public buildings, in alleyways, everywhere. It wasn't that they got knocked out during a fight either. His diagnostic spells confirmed most of them were completely healthy, barring some minor scrapes and bruises that were normal for the current conditions of the city. They seemed to have just suddenly dropped unconscious all of a sudden. He eventually found Alanik, Svim, and Zorian's brother Daimen. Gods above, how was he going to explain to the man that he just let his little brother? He shook his head and carefully approached. They were still unconscious, just like everyone he encountered so far. After a second of hesitation, he cast a memory reading spell and placed his hand on Svim's head. The spell encountered no resistance. He was sure that Svim had placed a mind-blank spell on him during the battle, but there was no trace of it now. He immediately dove into the man's memories, searching for any information regarding the time loop. His hand soon began to tremble. The man had no idea about any time loop. More than that, however, he didn't possess any memories of this entire month. Someone had quite literally memory wiped his entire recollection of said time period. He repeated his check on nearby Alanik and Daimen, with the same results. They were free of any knowledge of the time loop because they had no memory of anything that had transpired during this whole month. He breathed out heavily. "Zorian, you scary bastard, how did you even do this?" he said out loud. Wait. If he could do that to others, could he do it to him as well? Was any of this real? The moment the thought bubbled up to his mind, it refused to leave. He could feel something inside his soul wake up and demand a check. He had to know. He had to know as badly as a starving man needed food, a compulsion so strong it was essentially irresistible. He started casting a plethora of diagnostic divinations on himself, his surroundings, and the three unconscious people in front of him. He performed a multitude of little experiments he learned over the years to detect when illusionists messed with his surroundings. Nothing. His mind blank was still working. His mind was not being tampered with. The environment was behaving as it should, and the people in front of him were as complex as real people should be. He started to wander the city, casting memory spells on random people he found lying in the streets. By this time some people had started to wake up, but Zack simply walked past them, ignoring them as he went about his task. He wasn't really searching for any specific information. He was reading people's memories in order to find out trivial things like their favorite meals, what their mother looked like, or what the last story they'd heard was about. In other words, he was checking if they were real people. A mind mage, no matter how good, couldn't create a mind from scratch. Not a convincing one, in any case. A fake man would be a paper-thin disguise, capable of tricking only the most inexperienced of mind mages. However, Zack had gotten to know Zorian long enough that he couldn't discount anything. He could totally accept that Zorian could produce a convincing fake mind. The guy was just that scary. Maybe even a pair of fake minds. Maybe a dozen. By now he had read the memories of more than 100 people, though. All of them felt real. All of them were complex individuals with lots of little details about their lives and tangled histories that Zack could easily lose himself in for weeks at a time if he really wanted to figure them out. He refused to believe that anyone could create so many lives out of thin air. Even someone like Zorian. He lost track of time. He wandered around the city, checking on people. Anyone that was even slightly familiar with the time loop had lost their memories of the whole month. No exceptions. Even the Urania beneath Scioria were missing any memory of this month. An entire colony of skilled telepaths, but Zorian had somehow managed to convince them to willingly delete their own memories. Eventually, he accepted the truth. It was real. It was all real. Jornak was dead. Silver Lake too, she was done in by her old, real-world self, who lost her memories of the past month, but was otherwise unharmed. Nobody knew anything about the time loop except for him. He left the city. He couldn't look at it any longer. He found a small hill just outside the city walls that he and Zorian used to sit on sometimes, discussing their plans or just wasting time, and watched the fields around him in silence. He had no idea how long he stood there. He thought someone approached him at one point and asked him if he was all right, but he ignored them and they eventually went away. All he knew was that at some point he realized that someone was shooting fireworks into the sky. It was the night of the summer festival. The city may have just suffered a brutal invasion, but that was no reason to halt the celebrations. Hell, if anything, this just made the importance of a celebration that much greater. And Zack felt happy. He felt disgusted with himself for it, but he really did. Panicseth was still sealed and the conditions of his contract had been fulfilled. He was going to live past this month. He had won. He was Zack Novita, the last surviving member of Noble House Novita and the last surviving time looper. And he had won. He fell to his knees and began to cry. Somewhere deep inside his soul, he could feel the angel contract harmlessly dissolve, finally fulfilled. He was free, and all it cost him was the life of his best friend. He was Jornak Dokakin, a humble lawyer from Scioria, the true heir of House Denen, and the last surviving time looper. And he had won. The path had been long and difficult. He still remembered that fateful day he had realized Zack was a time traveler. The boy had been making scene after scene around the city, making nonsensical statements to the newspapers and everyone else who would listen, never once outright stating what he was, but very much hinting at it. Very few people had taken him seriously. Jornak hadn't either, in all honesty, not until the boy had come to him one day and asked him to help him figure out some legal documents he found lying around the living room. The documents blew Jornak's mind away. Not because the contents were so shocking, but because of what they implied. The people they implicated in crimes were so influential and highly placed, and the evidence so damning, that Jornak simply knew that Zack must have stolen them from the very people mentioned in the documents. Jornak knew exactly how hard that feat was. After the corrupt Eldamarian courts had taken the inheritance of House Denen away from him, he had come to understand that truth and the letter of the law were almost entirely inconsequential in the face of money, connections, and social status. He became a covert member of the cult of the World Dragon and rubbed shoulders with many powerful people. He came to know the darker undercurrents of Eldamar society, and knew what it would take to acquire this kind of dirt on someone. No amount of money could buy something like this, so how could Zack have possibly acquired these documents? Jornak had agonized over this question for days, dissecting every statement Zack had made, no matter how minor or nonsensical, and eventually came up with a crazy idea. The craziest idea, possibly. He confronted Zack with it, and the boy just laughed and admitted to it easily. Yes, he was a time traveler. In fact, he had lived through this month many, many times, and they had talked before. Jornak believed him. He wanted to believe him. His life had been rather dreary and frustrating for several years by that point. His career wasn't going anywhere, despite his attempts to build connections and increase his social standing. He had no success in love. His family was long dead. The inheritance of House Denen, his best chance at achieving greatness, was stolen from him. His youth was all but spent, and he felt he wasn't going anywhere. This looping time travel thing may have been completely insane, but Jornak was willing to take a chance on it. The two became fast friends. Zack explained that he had originally found Jornak because he'd befriended Veyers in one of the restarts, and the boy had introduced him to his lawyer friend. Zack's story about his caretaker selling Novita property for pocket change to his friends and then siphoning most of the money into his pockets fascinated Jornak almost as much as the time travel story itself. He wasn't that unique in his realization that Zack was a time traveler. Zack had been making a lot of noise during that particular restart, handing out clues to various people he was fond of, and a number of them had reached the same conclusion he had. Zack was also dating no less than 2 women at the time, both of them aware of the other and fine with it, and he'd outright told them the truth long before Jornak had met him. It was a fascinating group. He'd made a lot of new friends that month. There was a looming shadow over the whole thing, however, and it grew colder and more obvious with every passing day. Zach Novita wasn't a mage who invented time travel, merely a leaf caught in the storm. The mechanics of the time loop were merciless, and they would soon strike. As the end of the month approached, some people in the group got increasingly concerned. Jornak was one of them. During one evening when they were alone, and Zach had a little too much to drink, he admitted to Jornak that he would eventually stop interacting with him altogether. It had happened repeatedly in the past. Zach would get to know someone, interact with them over and over again, get emotionally attached to them, and then decide it was too painful to be around them in the future. The admission shook Jornak to his core. He wasn't sure why. He wouldn't really remember anything soon, so why did it matter that Zach would replace him with someone else in one of the future restarts? It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. He grew increasingly desperate, constantly probing Zach for any ideas about how he can keep existing after the month was over. He recruited the other members of Zach's group into his efforts, and eventually they managed to force an admission out of him. There was a way. A divine artifact, held by a lich, that could confer the status of a temporary looper upon a person. It would only be for 6 restarts, and Zach explained again and again why he didn't want to do it, why it was a bad idea, and so forth. It didn't matter not to Jornak, and not to the other people. 6 months was better than nothing. It was probably the two lovers that did most of the job of convincing Zach to play along with their request, Jornak suspected. Still, he was the one who organized the whole effort and he was very proud of it. The next 6 months were a great time, possibly the happiest in Jornak's life. He did not intend to betray Zach at that time, not at all. The boy was his best friend, and Jornak had every intention of helping him out in any way he could. But alas, 6 restarts had eventually passed. The second deadline started to approach. Tempers ran high. People started asking Zach for a way to prolong their time looping status, horrified that they were about to lose everything they had achieved during these past 6 months. Zach's mood continually worsened, both from him being heartbroken that the people he spent the past 6 months with were about to become lost to him, and the fact they were constantly badgering him about a solution that didn't exist. That he couldn't provide. Jornak's friendship with Zach also started to gradually deteriorate as the end approached. Jornak was far more interested in politics of the state and in what was happening behind closed doors of their nation's elite. He had come to know much, and he grew more disgusted with them than he ever had been. He talked to Zach often about these issues, but the boy was just a teenager at heart, and his perspective was narrow and naive. He simply wanted to get back at his caretaker, start rebuilding his house, and have fun. He did not appreciate the knowledge Jornak had painstakingly gathered, and found his methods to be immoral and disturbing. As the end of their temporary looper status approached, they clashed more and more frequently, and Jornak made the mistake of telling Zach exactly what he would do if he were in his place. The look Zach had given him when he stopped talking, Jornak would always remember that. Eventually Zach called for a group meeting. He swore again and again that he wasn't hiding any methods of prolonging their looping, and that there was nothing he could do. He promised them he would make them all temporary loopers again as soon as he could. He also privately promised Jornak he would supply his future looper with all the work he had done in those 6 restarts, but Jornak didn't believe him. The boy hadn't even read the last 2 reports Jornak gave him, much less memorized them. Even if he wanted to hand future Jornak the fruits of his work, how would he do it? Not to mention that he probably didn't even want to do it. He doubted Zach would even make him a temporary looper in the future. He remembered Zach's admission that he eventually dropped people from his social circle after interacting with them for a few restarts. He remembered the look Zach had given him not too long ago. And he decided he had to do something. He had never planned to betray Zach. He'd wanted to work with him. To help him. When one really thought about it, Zach was the one who betrayed him. Jornak himself was not a powerful man. His magical aptitude was entirely average, and not even the time loop could change that. But some of the people in the Looper group were magically powerful, and their skills had only gotten better due to Zack's willingness to help them grow. Getting them to side with him was tricky, but not too difficult. Desperation made people do previously unthinkable things. Contacting Quatakikl and arranging a meeting with him without being immediately killed had been hard, but not nearly as hard as he had feared it would be. From that point on, everything kind of slid into place. In the end, that path had led him here, locked in a deadly battle against his one-time best friend and fellow time-traveling companion Zack. He had to admit, he had been pretty worried for a while. The ability he'd gotten from Panicseth was not nearly as effective as he thought it would be. Weren't primordials supposed to be on the level of gods? He expected more out of primordial magic, to be honest. That prison should have taken some kind of advanced, specialized magic to get out of, but Zack had an appropriate spell for breaking it already in his arsenal. Then, when they were pulled back into Scioria proper, it was just in time to see Zorian banish Quatakikl back to his phylactery with the help of a flower. He dimly recognized it as a soul-sizer chrysanthemum. What an obscure magical creature. In any case, he was of two minds about this. On one hand, he needed the ancient lich to win this. On the other hand, it was satisfying to see the black-hearted bastard finally get knocked down a peg or two. And besides, he still had the dragon M. Oganj left. He took the crown and the orb, and he just left. Unbelievable. Jornak had given him so much for his assistance as forward payment materials, maps, records of draconic magic that humans had taken from other dragon mages, everything, but Oganj still chose to switch sides in exchange for 2 thrice-damned divine artifacts. A familiar bitterness welled up from the back of his mind. Everyone always betrayed him. He was so fed up with everything. He still didn't think the situation was hopeless. He started the invasion a day before the actual deadline for releasing Panicseth, so he had some time for another attempt. He would activate all of his contingencies and plunge the country into chaos. He would activate all of the remaining wraith bombs in other cities. He refused to believe his enemies had enough countermeasures to disable them all, or that they had even managed to track down every single one of them. He would assassinate people and mind control critical individuals into starting hostilities with every nearby country. He would sick the police and Eldamar's military on them, their allies, friends, and family. He would descend straight into the hole and lure the monsters lurking in the deepest layer of the dungeon back to the surface to wreak havoc on it until the city was nothing but ruins. It was suboptimal. He wanted to rule this country, and make it better, not bring it to its knees. However, he had to be alive in order to improve things, and his opponents had forced his hand. If this was the only path they had left for him, he would not hesitate. He was. Suddenly, that other looper, Zorian Kaczynski, teleported next to them and immediately rushed towards them. Zorian Jornak had so many regrets in regards to the boy. He shouldn't have panicked and fled the time loop when he realized there were other time loopers aside from him and Zack, but it made perfect sense at the time. The information he had gotten from the Urania said there was a small legion of them, which was entirely possible. If Zack wanted to and had the crown, he could have made the entire city into temporary loopers. What if Panicseth decided some of them would make for a better champion than him? And if Zack was creating so many loopers, he probably knew about the Sovereign Gate and how to leave the time loop. He couldn't play around and risk things. The safest thing to do was to leave as soon as possible. As it turned out, there was just one additional looper, and he hadn't gotten in through Zack's actions. He got in through some weird mistake in the time loop system. Jornak couldn't even begin to describe how jealous he was of the boy when he heard that. He had to go through so much trouble to keep existing, and then this boy got all of that and more through a simple stroke of luck. The world was sometimes so unfair. But no matter, this was perfect. He didn't know what had possessed the boy to get this close to him all of a sudden, but he wasn't going to waste a golden opportunity like this. He drew the imperial dagger out of his belt with a smooth, practiced motion, its weight and shape familiar and comforting in his hand. The dagger had long been his oldest and most reliable companion, and if he could, he always recovered it from the royal vaults, where it was just uselessly gathering dust. He had spent many years tinkering with it and learning everything it could do. The dagger lit up with a faint purple glow as he thrust it toward Zorian. The Imperial dagger was mostly known for its ability to hurt spirits easily, but it had several alternate modes, and this was one of them. The third looper arrogantly refused to dodge his strike, instead placing his defense device in front of him to ward off the blow. Jornak would be first to admit that the cube was an incredible achievement that left him in awe of Zorian's ingenuity and skill, but it was ultimately just a mortal item. The dagger pierced through the complex, multi-layer shield projected by the cube like it didn't exist and then stabbed right through the alchemically reinforced metal like it was paper. To his credit, this wasn't enough to take the boy down. Zorian reacted quickly, telekinetically moving his body out of the way of the knife while simultaneously hurling the ruined cube into the sky. Having suffered catastrophic damage, the cube exploded above their heads moments later, showering the area with serrated metal fragments and exotic magical energies. Jornak locked eyes with Zorian, unsurprised by the boy's quick reactions. Though he was standing here partially due to luck, Zorian Kaczynski was someone that had repeatedly shown himself to be a shrewd and decisive person. When Jornak was about to capture and interrogate him back in the time loop, he killed himself without hesitation to deny him useful information. What's more, the action was clearly a pre-planned contingency and he had enough presence of mind as he ran to make sure Jornak would be unable to recover his body. He did not expect him to die so easily. Still, with his best defensive tool destroyed, and with him momentarily unbalanced, Jornak decided to bet it all on one last push. This was extremely dangerous and may very well end with him killed, but it wasn't the first time he risked his life for a chance to live, and it probably wouldn't be the last. He wrapped his hand around a small black bottle hanging from his neck and squeezed, shattering it with ease with his supernatural strength. Hundreds of black shapes suddenly slipped from between his fingers, expanding in size as they filled the skies above them. Vaguely humanoid, the entities looked like legless incorporeal humans in tattered pitch-black cloaks. Wraiths. The whole area immediately began to feel uncomfortably chilly as the mere presence of so many of them began to leach minute amounts of life force from the three combatants, and resonant whispers filled the air as wraiths began to babble in that usual incomprehensible nonsense they constantly spouted. Wraiths were mysterious creatures, with unclear origins and very few methods of effectively fighting them. In many ways, they almost resembled spirits, but they were usually classified as undead due to their ability to convert human souls into more of themselves. They were difficult to control. Jornak did not actually have any ability to direct the wraith horde he had just released from his miniature wraith bomb, and he had no doubt the wraiths would see him as just as big of a target as the other two people present. However, Jornak was betting he would have a definite advantage anyway, because he had something he didn't think either of the other two had: sophisticated, well-honed soul magic skills. Soul magic was a sinister branch of magic, requiring a lot of cruel and unpleasant experimentation and willingness to deal and negotiate with some very loathsome people. Jornak had long accepted this, and he did not let it bother him. He had tortured entire villages of people, over and over again, to see how different soul magic methods affected the same soul over various restarts. He sold kidnapped babies and small orphans to some of the more unscrupulous witches that were willing to teach him their skills in exchange for suitable material. He spoke with demon summoners, participating in their disgusting rituals in order to prove his sincerity. His magical talents may be average, but he was confident that there were few people who could boast about having a similar level of skill when it came to soul magic. Zack certainly wasn't one of them, and Silver Lake was adamant that Zorian wasn't that much better. His opponents knew it too. When they saw the wraiths flood the area, the two of them tried to retreat and regroup elsewhere, but how could Jornak allow that? He stopped them. He foiled their teleportation, he wrenched them back when they tried to fly away, and when the two attacked him together and he was forced to choose between being wounded and letting them flee, he chose to get wounded. His regeneration ability was not nearly as potent as that of Silver Lake, but his body was far more resilient than that of a regular person, and healed quickly. So long as he didn't black out and could cast magic, it was fine. He would bear it. He would outlast them, outlast everyone, and win. He had to win. All of the sacrifices, all the things he'd done, it couldn't have been all in vain. He was close, so very close to the end. In the end, he triumphed. His soul defenses were honed to perfection, yet even he strained to deal with so many wraiths relentlessly assaulting him. Zack and Zorian. They couldn't compare. Maybe if they hadn't expended so many of their resources before they decided to tackle him, they could have got themselves out of this situation, but alas. For all their power and skill, in the end, all it took was one mistake for them to fall and be devoured by wraiths. Jornak quietly thanked Zorian for deciding to join the battle when he had. If Jornak had been unable to catch both of his enemies at once in his wraith trap, this wouldn't have worked. The moment the two loopers fell, Jornak fled the site and waited for the wraiths to scatter before returning to check up on them. Always check the bodies to make sure your enemies were really dead, after all. This was especially true when dealing with enemies on the level of Zack and Zorian. A minute later, he breathed a sigh of release. They were really dead. It was over. He started to laugh. Yes. Yes. He knew he could do it. Now was not the time for gloating, however. That would come later. For now, he started searching the city for his partner, Silverlake. He eventually found her not far from where he fought Zack and Zorian. Or what was left of her, anyway. She was really just an empty bag of skin now. After cautiously kneeling down and inspecting the skin, he found 2 large puncture wounds in her chest and no other notable damage. Something, probably some kind of magical creature, had liquefied her insides and slurped it all out, leaving this preserved husk behind. Jornak frowned. Silverlake was probably the weakest one from among the 4 of them that had managed to escape from the time loop, but she shouldn't have been this easy to kill. In fact, despite being the weakest, Jornak suspected she was the hardest of them to kill, both because her primordial abilities were all defensive in nature and because she herself was a cowardly wretch that would no doubt flee at the first hint of actual danger. The creature that had killed her some kind of spider, maybe? In any case, it had to be very powerful. On the level of a dragon, really. How did a creature like that get here, and where was it now? And why hadn't Silverlake simply retreated if she had encountered something like that? Magical creatures generally had little ability to stop high-level mages from fleeing if outmatched, unless they were sapient spellcasters in their own right. Concerning. Still. Maybe it was better this way. Jornak hadn't actually liked Silverlake that much. She had brought him some very useful knowledge, and for that, he would always be grateful to her, but she was also clearly playing her own game and knew too much about Jornak's true nature for him to be comfortable with it. This way there was one less person potentially messing up his plans. With Silverlake dead, it fell to him to fulfill their bargain with Panicseth and set him loose upon the world. He threw himself into the task without hesitation, rallying the invader forces under his banner and gathering the surviving cultists that had scattered around the city after their defeat near the hole. While most of the cultists had perished, their leaders and high-level members were powerful and resourceful enough to survive for the most part, and they were the most important part anyway. Jornak had them set up the ritual while the Abasan army protected them, and used his own primordial essence in place of the shifter children that the defenders had managed to rescue and evacuate out of the city. He had thought about trying to recover them, but eventually decided that would take too long. Eldamar was already mobilizing their whole army to crush this invasion, and he had no time to lose. Using his own primordial essence was going to weaken him for a long time, and disable most of his primordial magic, but he would rather pay this price than risk dying at the end of the month because he had wasted too much time. Imagine if that happened. He, the ultimate victor of the time loop war, ended up dying because he had failed to release Panicseth before the Eldamar army rolled into the city and killed all his underlings. He would die wallowing in shame and embarrassment. No, he would pay the price with his own flesh and blood and do things properly. No gains without sacrifice. The ritual went off without issue. Space cracked, the prison broke, and then Panicseth burst into existence above the city, his fleshy limbs reaching out of his prison and burying themselves into the roads and buildings. Then, he slowly started to drag his entire bulk out of the pocket dimension that had contained him all these millennia. Jornak immediately fled. He may have been Panicseth's champion, but he did not trust the primordial at all. His part of the contract was finished, in any case. Funny, he thought he would be able to feel it when the restriction lifted, but there was nothing. The death pact Panicseth placed on him simply disappeared from his perception. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. Well, it was primordial magic, after all. Who knows how that worked? He was finally free, that was all that mattered. The cultists, arrogant idiots that they were, stayed behind. Jornak knew that they had some kind of crazy plan that involved binding the primordial to their will and becoming gods in the process, but it was lunacy. They were like ants trying to enslave a tiger. Even weakened, Panicseth was not something they could handle. Even a fragment of him could probably annihilate them. The primordial let loose a deep, resonant rumble that made the whole city visibly vibrate. Some of the weaker buildings, weakened by the fires and the fighting, immediately collapsed from it. Then the rampage began. Abasan forces were retreating now as fast as they could, but Jornak knew most of them would never make it. He took one last look at the unraveling city and then teleported away. He wanted to be as far as possible from the area. Eventually, Jornak made his way to Ayaska Mansion. The place was thoroughly trashed, its wards broken and most of the souls that powered it set free when their prison cracked and crumbled, but the structure itself was still standing when the angel was done venting its ire on it. Probably because Sudamir placed and set smaller, but far stronger defensive wards around the ward core that housed his wife's soul, and the angel didn't want to spend time breaking it down when there were more important battles happening elsewhere. The angel then dropped the barrier that had kept Ayaska Mansion contained, and Sudamir enacted another long-distance teleport ritual to translocate the mansion out of the city, and then all the way to Ulquin Abasa. This was something that Sudamir had long since arranged with Quatakikl in case things went wrong with their plan. Sitting in one of the few intact rooms inside the mansion, Jornak had been feeling quite pleased with himself, basking in the glow of his own success, when another person entered the room. Quatakikl. The Lich was in his human guise now, though Quatakikl insisted this form was just as true as his battle form, and he looked as relaxed and confident as ever. Jornak wanted to make some snide comments about him getting taken out by a flower, but he refrained. More than Zack, Zorian, or anyone else, the ancient Lich was the one that really terrified Jornak. He didn't think even his fellow loopers really understood the force they were dealing with when they tangled with him. Without Quatakikl, Jornak would never have been able to make himself a permanent looper. Oh sure, Panicseth was the one who supplied him with a method of transforming his temporary marker into a permanent one, but never in a million years would Jornak have been able to actually use the method himself. No, he had to beg Quatakikl for assistance to help him perform the task. And the price for the Lich's help, even now Jornak couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. The soul fragment had been with Jornak for the entire duration of his stay in the time loop, and even Jornak wasn't sure what it was up to during that time. Was it merely patiently waiting to return to its master, containing only the memories of that one Quatakikl Jornak made the deal with? Or was it watching and learning the whole time, riding him like a spying parasite? He didn't know. All he knew was that once he left the time loop and was incarnated in the real world, the soul fragment immediately left him and rejoined Quatakikl. Jornak had no need to convince the Lich he was a time traveler. Quatakikl already knew, and was waiting for him when Jornak came knocking. He had no idea how much the ancient Lich knew about what happened in the time loop, and it scared him. So, Quatakikl said, sitting down in one of the nearby chairs. I think we can safely describe this operation as a success, yes. Yes, absolutely, Jornak agreed. Though, if I may make an observation, the damage made by the primordial seemed to be somewhat underwhelming. Scioria will be no more after today, that is true, but the country as a whole will survive. Aren't you worried they will launch a punitive expedition against your homeland for this? Your involvement in this will be impossible to hide. Oh no, I fully expect them to retaliate in some manner, Quatakikl said. I welcome it. Our leaders have been very foolish lately, trying to set up trade treaties with the mainland and other such nonsense. A nice war or two will be good for us. Jornak nodded. This kind of attitude meshed pretty well with the Lich's attitude in their past conversations. What about you? The Lich asked. Aren't you worried? Why would I be? Jornak asked curiously. I won. It was a close thing, Quatakikl remarked. A win is a win, Jornak insisted. He glared slightly at the Lich. Besides, it wouldn't have been that close if you hadn't stupidly got yourself killed. And by a flower, no less. Soul-sizers are curious creatures, Quatakikl said lightly, clearly not bothered by the swipe. Or at least not giving any visible indication that he was. The ancient Lich's poker face was too good. I'll have to look into them when I find the time. Alas, I suspect the next few years are going to be very busy for me indeed. Well, he was certainly right about that. For one thing, Jornak fully intended to start executing his plans the moment he left from here. He and the Lich had completely incompatible plans for the future, and were pretty much guaranteed to start sabotaging each other's efforts soon. Really, Jornak wouldn't be surprised if Quatakikl tried to kill him here today. Unfortunately for him, Jornak was well aware of this possibility and had taken every possible precaution before coming here. He won't die here. He won't die ever. He was only just starting, really. What would you have done if the invasion failed? Quatakikl asked, sounding genuinely curious. A multitude of contingencies floated in Jornak's mind in response to the Lich's question: explosive traps in numerous cities and buildings meant to cause mass casualties, assassination contracts that would be executed unless he called them off, documents unmasking Zack and Zorian just waiting to be discovered by the authorities. He had many ways to make his enemies regret their victory if he ever lost. Still, he told none of them to Quatakikl. Although he planned to dismantle all of them now, there was no reason to reveal his methods and reasoning to someone who would soon become his bitter enemy. He quickly checked his mental defenses and found that his mind blank was still on and in perfect condition. Good. For a moment he was afraid Quatakikl was trying to pick up answers straight from his surface thoughts. Still, he felt an urge to brag a little. He started to ramble about one of his less important contingencies, a bundle of documents implicating Zorian in the events of the invasion, deliberately placed in one of the cabinets of the police building in Corsa. The cabinet was rarely used, but its owner was very dutiful and meticulous. It would take weeks for the documents to be discovered, and by that time Zack and Zorian will have likely stopped being on high alert for such things and should hopefully be caught completely by surprise. Then there was that letter he sent straight to the royal residence. It should be arriving. He suddenly stopped talking. Why was he telling the Lich this? Didn't he just conclude they were going to become enemies soon and that it would be best to stay quiet? And the expression on Quatakikl's face, he was leaning forward and listening with bated breath, like this was the most interesting thing ever. What? Who are you? Jornak suddenly snapped, jumping from his chair and going on full combat alert. He had spent enough time around the Lich to learn some of his mannerisms, and this didn't look like him. In fact, when he really thought about it, his entire demeanor this whole time was slightly off. You're not Quatakikl. Why do you say that? The impostor asked, feigning calm curiosity. Jornak fired a blistering beam of red light at the impostor, who didn't even try to dodge. The beam went straight through his forehead without any resistance. The man wearing Quatakikl's face sighed. So impersonating the Lich is a lost cause, he lamented to himself. No matter how many times I try, I just can't seem to portray him convincingly. It's a shame, since he's the one you're most likely to really talk with about all the details. Maybe I should try Silver Lake. What? Wait. No. No. You can't be. You can't be him. Jornak protested, his voice getting more and more panicked. I killed you. I know I did. Your soul got devoured by wraiths. I have a mind blank on, that spell is total protection against dash. He checked his mind. He checked it again, and then a third time. Always the same result. His mind blank was still one. His mind was protected. Except it wasn't. None of this is real, Jornak realized. Well then, the imposter in the guise of Quatakikl said. Let's try this again, shall we? Jornak's heart went cold. How many times had he done this? How many times had he lived through this day, enjoying his triumph, making grand plans about what would come next, only to forget all about it again and again? All the while some sinister force keeps talking to him, pumping him for information, varying their approach in this or that way, to get what they wanted out of him. His mind couldn't help but hearken back to his time in the time loop, back when he was just a humble lawyer wishing there was more to his life. Back to when he realized his life was literally an endless loop meant to exploit him. It was just like that now, but worse. Infinitely worse. His vision began to darken. He wanted to do something, wanted to send a signal to his various contingencies in one final act of spite, but his mind was fading. He forgot Zorian's words, forgot what led him to this place, forgot any of this ever happened. He found himself back in Cyoria, surrounded by corpses of Zack and Zorian, knowing only one thing. He was Jornak Dokakin, a humble lawyer from Cyoria, the true heir of House Denen, and the last surviving time looper. And he had won. Again, and again, and again. He was Zorian Kaczynski, the third son of a minor merchant family from Siren, accidental time traveler, and quite possibly the most powerful human mind mage in all of Altazia. And he had won. It was not an easy task to arrange all of this. Sure, he could have beaten Jornak and Silver Lake, stopped the ritual, and left it at that, but that would be a very bittersweet outcome. Zack would have died at the end of the month and Zorian would have spent the rest of his future running away from Eldamarian assassins and whatnot. Zorian did not spend all those years in the time loop just to settle for a suboptimal outcome. The first task, of course, was figuring out how to get past the mind blank spell. Even before he had known about Zack's angelic contract, he'd known the boy was hiding something of critical importance that he would have to wrench out of his head. Thus, he worked with Svim, Orania, and many others to find the solution. A way to beat the ultimate mental defense, a spell that had been providing total protection against mind magic, no exceptions, for literal centuries now. A lot of people Zorian had worked with thought it was a fool's task to begin with. What did Zorian have that so many other mind mages that tried to invent a workaround hadn't? But Zorian didn't embark upon this idea blindly. He already had an idea before he threw himself into the project. The Soul-Sizer chrysanthemum was a very rare and obscure magical creature. It was so dangerous and frightening to people that they had long since eradicated it in more civilized areas, not even bothering to study it properly before doing so. Who was brave enough to research a flower that would eat your soul if you made a mistake in restraining it? Not many people. It didn't help that the plant was a very valuable component for many potions, meaning it was worth more dead than alive to begin with. In modern times, of course, some mage or organization would have probably become interested in the Soul-Sizer and organized a hunt so its abilities could be studied, except that the plant only lived in monster-infested wilderness these days, was surprisingly good at hiding, and smart enough to pick its fights carefully. Plus, its abilities were not well known, and old descriptions found in ancient tomes did not do the creature justice. They made the chrysanthemum look like a simple plant-shaped soul eater. It just wasn't that impressive sounding. Zorian had experienced the flower's attack firsthand, however. Zack hadn't thought much about their experience, seeing it only as an embarrassing instance where they had nearly been beaten by a flower, and soon forgot about it. But Zorian had never forgotten. The way the plant's initial stunning attack had simply bypassed all of their defenses left a deep impression on him. If the chrysanthemum could bypass their defenses by targeting their body, mind, and soul simultaneously, could the same method be used to target someone's mind even when it was protected by the mind blank? Mind blank protected the mind by separating it from what the Urania called the Great Web. The mind closed in on itself, rejecting all contact. But it was still connected to the brain, and to the soul. It should be possible to target the mind by going through those two, somehow. This wasn't a new idea, by any means, but most people who tried to make such a method work before hadn't had the soul-sizer chrysanthemum on hand to provide a working example of how such a thing would work in practice. Zorian did. And he had a whole host of experts in both soul magic and mind magic to help him figure it out. The process of studying the chrysanthemum's abilities had some unintended benefits. He probably would not have found a way to negate the wraith bombs in a reasonable amount of time if he hadn't spent so much time studying the flower and its abilities, and he wouldn't have been able to make the weapon that Merva had used to disable Quadakikl for a few moments. These were all just side benefits, however, paling in importance to the real end goal of the research, the manifold resonance spell. The spell was not ideal by any means. First of all, the magic Zorian and his team designed could only be used through touch. Skin-to-skin contact was required to successfully cast the spell. It was also incredibly complicated and hard to control. 3 whole minds were needed to execute the spell. Not an impossible requirement for someone who could make simulacrums like Zorian could, but still an issue. Finally, targets eventually acquired a resistance to it. Experiments showed that targeting the same person repeatedly with the spell made them instinctively resist it after only a handful of attempts. In the case of people with highly trained defenses like Svim and Alanik, that meant they became resistant after only 2 or 3 attempts. But it worked. It was complicated and inconvenient, but it did the impossible, and that was all that mattered. With the spell to bypass mind blank in his arsenal, actual victory was finally possible. In the end, that path had led him here, locked in a deadly battle against his fellow time travelers Zack and Jornak. When Zorian teleported next to the 2 combatants and lunged at them, hands glowing, he knew neither would take it lying down. Zack looked shocked at his sudden betrayal, but he was an experienced fighter and reacted immediately, firing a pair of blindingly bright white rays that nearly took Zorian's head off. Only his defense cube saved him, by warping space around him slightly to make the beams miss. As for Jornak, he drew the Imperial dagger out of his belt with a smooth, practiced motion and thrust it straight at Zorian's face. Zorian didn't know much about the Imperial dagger. Its main ability out of the time loop was supposed to be its ability to hurt spirits, but why take that chance? He doubted Jornak would try to use it on him if it wasn't uniquely useful in this situation. He jumped back a little, evading the stab at the cost of losing some momentum and giving up some of his advantage of surprise. Zorian, what dash? Zack started saying, outrage evident in his voice. He never got to finish it. A marble Zorian accidentally dropped out of his pocket before he jumped back suddenly. Activated and instantly sucked in all the air around them, creating a sizable area of total vacuum between them. The surrounding air quickly rushed in to fill the void, forcefully dragging all 3 of them into the center of the area. Jornak and Zack were unharmed, but caught off guard. But Zorian was ready. The moment they collided with each other, he clamped down on Zack and Jornak's hands and cast the spell. A faint blue wave quickly rippled through them, expanding from the point of contact to envelop their whole bodies. They still had their mind blank spells on, but it didn't matter. Their bodies went limp, insensate to the world around them. A moment later, they were plunged into a constructed dream world over which Zorian had total control. It was an incredible achievement, creating this thing, and this wasn't just Zorian praising himself. The Urania were also in awe of the scale of what he created. That said, he wasn't doing this alone. Aside from him and his simulacrums, many Arania were helping him control the illusionary world. On top of that, he wasn't really conjuring people's surroundings out of nothing. He was accessing eyes of people around the city and his iron beaks in the sky to give Zack and Jornak as convincing of an experience as he possibly could. He had to mess with their memories slightly. Mostly to make it look like they won in a convincing manner, a process that took some trial and error, since Zorian didn't have a perfect understanding of their capabilities and habits. Thankfully, any mistake could be covered up by simply wiping away their short-term memories and letting them relive the battle again and again until he got it right. He also had to adjust Zack's perception of what happened to Quadakekl, since his contract couldn't be fulfilled unless the Lich was seemingly dead. He made it look like his chrysanthemum weapon actually managed to suck out Quadakekl's soul and kill him for good, which Zack thankfully accepted as actually possible. Zorian took it as a compliment that Zack had that much faith in his artifice. Then there was the matter of Zack going around reading people's minds. Zorian had known that Zack would try that. After all, how else was he going to confirm that people did not know anything about the time loop? Unfortunately, the boy was right that Zorian couldn't really create convincing fake minds. Even the dumbest, most boring person in existence had a mind more complex and intricate than anything Zorian could conjure purely from his own imagination. So he didn't even try. Through his network of sigils around the city, Zorian was potentially connected to every person who was still alive there. He could act as a mental bridge, allowing Zack to connect to any person in the city through him. The minds he was reading were very much real. Sadly, that also meant that when Zack checked people's minds and saw they didn't remember anything that had happened during this past month, this was in no way faked. They really didn't remember anything. Zorian was forced to strip them of their mind blanks through dispelling, and wipe away their memories of the month. He had thought about being more selective about it, but he wanted things to be absolutely convincing to whatever evaluation mechanics Zack's angel contract employed. He had gifted people like Svim, Alanik, and Diamond memory crystals containing their deleted memories for later perusal, but he knew that wasn't nearly the same as having their real memories. They weren't trained psychics like he was, so digesting their memories from such a source would be a struggle. As for the Arania, deleting their memories of the whole month was kind of tricky, since they were helping Zorian run this whole illusion, and he needed their help right now. Obviously, them not having any memories of all this would be a bit of a problem. Thus, only the Arania that Zack actually deigned to talk to deleted their memories, and Zack was never overly fond of the giant spiders. Thus, the damage to the integrity of the illusion was minimal in the end. Even better, Zorian didn't have to provide the Arania with anything to make them recover after this. They had their own well-developed system of storing their memories and had lots of practice of integrating stored memories into their minds later, so it shouldn't be a big chore for them to recover quickly. As for Jornak, the main reason he was trapped in his own private illusion was because Zorian wanted to find all the dead man switches the guy had scattered all over the place. He knew Jornak would make them suffer from beyond the grave if they just let him die. He needed to find out what he had in store for them and how to disarm his traps and contingencies. He tried to simply get their fellow time traveler to simply talk about his plans. It was a good thing he did. He had done a basic search of his memories, of course, but searching someone's memories for information depended on knowing what to look for, and Zorian knew that Jornak was a lot more devious and experienced in this kind of cloak and dagger bullshit than he was. It only took a few conversations with Jornak, in various guises, to understand that he would have missed many things if he simply tried lifting things out of his mind. However, even this wasn't enough. Jornak had no real friends. His closest emotional attachment was to the damn Imperial dagger, of all things. Thus, he was understandably cagey around other people, even when Zorian prodded him with subtle suggestions and emotional manipulation to make him more talkative. Eventually Zorian resorted to messing with Jornak's perception of time, making him believe days or weeks had passed in order to learn what he would have done, and what he expected to happen. Meanwhile, the invasion of the city was being beaten back all over the city. All of the invasion leaders except the upper echelons of the cult of the World Dragon were gone now, and they were unable to rally the disparate forces around their leadership. Eventually the higher echelons of the Abasin forces found out that Quatakikl was no longer present on the battlefield, and sounded a retreat. Ayaska Mansion was mostly demolished, but Sudamir had somehow managed to survive the Angel's wrath by protecting the core of the mansion through particularly powerful wards. The surviving Abasins hurriedly gathered around the ruin, after which Sudamir translocated it out of the city. Annoyingly, Zorian had no option but to let it go. He was too busy to chase after them, his most powerful allies were incapacitated, and the other city defenders couldn't get through the gathered Abasin forces fast enough. He would later find out that Sudamir translocated his mansion 2 more times after that, eventually landing on Ulquin Abasa, where he was granted refuge by the natives. Great. If Eldamar had any doubts as to who to blame for the attack, they were unambiguously sure now. Not that Quatakikl, the instigator of the attack, cared about that. If Zorian had learned anything from Jornak's mind, it was that Quatakikl was likely quite happy with this outcome. Kiriel and Kana were alive and well, despite the attack on them. Zorian breathed a big sigh of relief when he found that out. Sadly, Kostyenka joined Merva in the Hall of Heroic Golems by sacrificing herself to save his little sister. An event that caused many tears on Kiriel's part and prompted Zorian to consider if he should perhaps delete her memories of the whole incident and quietly replace Kostyenka's remains with an unharmed copy. But no, that was a bad idea. He shouldn't be that casual with memory wipes. And besides, Kiriel didn't know anything about golem theory, so she shouldn't see anything wrong with Zorian fixing Kostyenka into pristine condition. Overall, things had turned out great. He had to give away the Imperial Orb to get rid of Oganj, Quatakikl and Sudamir were still alive and would probably make moves against them in the future, and there was a high chance of another continental war brewing in the near future, but it could have been worse. His friends and family were all alive, Zack was alive, and he was alive. The only thing that kind of worried him was that he found Silver Lake's empty skin back where he left her fighting with her original self. It was clear that the spider not just killed her, but ate her as well. Which was strange. Grey hunters primarily ate powerful magical creatures. To his knowledge, they thought humans tasted vile. The flesh wasn't magical enough for their tastes. Why was Silver Lake eaten, then? Was it because of all the primordial essence Silver Lake's body contained? There was no trace of the Grey Hunter anywhere in the city, and Zorian had pretty much total coverage of everything on the surface at the moment. He had a sinking feeling the spider had fled into the local underground. Which meant he had just let an immensely powerful magical predator, one that had recently gorged upon a great amount of primordial essence, no less escape into the one place where there was absolutely no hope of tracking it down. He sighed. There was no use in worrying about this now. The deadline had come and passed. Zack's contract with the Angels had harmlessly dissolved, and Jornak's death pact claimed his life in a gruesome fashion, his own flesh turning against itself like a country in the throes of a civil war. Observing with his more magical senses, Zorian noticed that even the man's mind and soul were seemingly tearing themselves apart. After a few seconds of disgusting writhing and convulsing, Jornak simply collapsed in a pile of unsightly goo. Zorian opened his eyes, letting the spell finally collapse. He breathed a sigh of relief. He was beyond exhausted. He and his simulacrums had maintained a fake illusionary world, 2 of them, actually, and had done that for more than a day, without rest or sleep. He was no longer alone, however. He had moved to a secluded, secure space with Zack and Jornak in tow, but it wasn't really secret to Daimen, Svim, and Alanik. All 3 were currently watching him with grave, vaguely unfriendly expressions. Svim was sitting on a nearby chair, a small book in his hand. Alanik was standing in the center of the room, his hands folded over his chest. And Daimen was leaning against the nearby doorway, blocking the exit and juggling the imperial dagger that Zorian had removed from Jornak's possessions. All 3 were also clutching memory crystals in one of their hands. Zorian doubted they had absorbed more than a small fraction of the memories stored in them, but they probably knew enough to understand the general situation. "We need to talk," Alanik said blandly. Rather than answering, Zorian ripped out a paper from a nearby notebook and started furiously writing on it while explaining the situation to all three of them. A whole bunch of Jornak's contingencies were about to activate relatively soon, and they had to be dealt with as soon as possible. His rushed scribblings were meant to be a reminder if they forgot some of the details he was telling them. The three people in front of him seemed to be part annoyed and part curious about his rushed explanation, but they were polite enough to stay silent and listen while he was talking. It didn't take long, anyway. Only a handful of Jornak's plans were so very time-critical. His list of instructions done, Zorian stumbled to his feet, his limbs not working properly due to the long period of disuse, and thrust the written list straight into Alanik's confused hands before falling to the floor, unconscious. He was Zorian Kaczynski, third son of a minor merchant family from Siren, accidental time traveler, and quite possibly the most powerful human mind mage in all of Altazia. And he had won. And now it was time to finally get some rest. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother," an annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning, morning, morning." Panic. Zorian's awakened mind felt nothing but pure, all-consuming terror. After all of his efforts, all the sacrifices he and people around him had made, it was all for naught. He was back where it all began, in his room in Siren, about to start his third year at the academy. Then the moment passed, and the nightmare dissolved. The room around him was wrong. This wasn't his room back in Siren. He was in Scioria, in the room he shared with Kiriel, at Amaya's place. And the little devil was currently still sprawled across his stomach, kicking her legs up in the air and giving him a mischievous, expectant look. His panicked reaction didn't seem to worry her. If anything, she seemed quite pleased with herself for managing to scare him so thoroughly. "Kiriel, why?" Zorian asked, resisting the urge to sigh. "What do you mean?" she asked innocently. "I always wake you up like this." "Not with those exact words, you don't," Zorian groused. "He put you up to this, didn't he?" "Zack said it was going to be funnier this way," Kiriel admitted, propping her chin with her hands. She gave him a toothy smile. Zorian flipped her over the edge of the bed in response, causing her to fall to the floor with a silent thud. The little imp had expected the reaction, and made no sound in response, simply scrambling to her feet immediately afterwards. "It's been a month already," Zorian grumbled. "Just when is he planning to stop with this petty revenge crap?" It wasn't like Zorian had wanted to deceive him like that. He'd done that to save Zack's life, for heaven's sake. Well, at least he hadn't gotten another punch in the face for that. He chased Kiriel out of the room and got dressed, idly listening to the sounds of the house and its tenants as he did. Amaya's place was very busy these days, nothing like the quiet household Zorian had gotten used to during the time loop. The academy dorms had suffered heavy damage during the invasion, both in the initial artillery bombardment and the fighting that had followed afterwards, which meant that a lot of students were suddenly homeless and in dire need of alternate accommodations. Since Amaya's house had survived the invasion mostly intact, it was soon filled to capacity and even slightly beyond. Zorian didn't really like it, but the situation was what it was, and there was nothing he could do to change it. At least Kiriel had plenty of people to talk to these days. After composing himself a little, he left the room and entered the kitchen, where a dozen or so people had already gathered, some of them still eating breakfast, and some of them pondering a stack of textbooks and papers arranged around them. Most of the people gathered here were his classmates. Akoja, Rainey, Kiana, Capriva, Kale, Naeem, Edwin, and Eston were all gathered around the small table that was far too small to really accommodate them all. They immediately stopped what they were doing and turned to look at him as he entered, calling out greetings. Ilsa, who was sitting at a relatively prominent place at the table, was flipping through a stack of papers on her clipboard, and simply gave him a curt nod, before returning to her task. Nachka, Kiriel, and Kana were on the floor, playing with dolls and getting into everyone's way from time to time. Zorian had no idea why they felt the need to play their games here, instead of somewhere more private, but nobody else was shooing them away, so he wouldn't do it either. As for Amaya, the landlord of this place, she was working around the kitchen while humming a happy tune to herself, looking like she was having the time of her life, despite the current overcrowded state of her home. Zorian knew she was getting paid for this, but he still couldn't quite understand her good mood. Some people were just weird. After a few seconds of looking around, Zorian suddenly realized there were no free chairs left anymore. This is what happens when you wake up late, Capriva helpfully explained to him. There should be some free chairs in the next room, Amaya added, stirring the contents of some giant pot, not even bothering to turn around and look at him. You should probably grab a nightstand or a wooden board or something, just so you have a surface to write on, Edwin told him. The table is a little crowded right now. Resisting a sigh, Zorian went about securing himself a chair and then carving out a place for himself at the table. This took a considerable amount of pushing and arguing, but eventually he managed to squeeze himself between Kale and Naeem. Amaya immediately plopped down a plate of food in front of him and immediately walked away, not giving Zorian a chance to tell her he wasn't hungry. You really need to learn how to be more assertive in life, Naeem advised from his left. Zorian raised his eyebrow at him. Weren't you the one who just tried to chase me away from your side of the table? Zorian asked. Well, yeah, you need to be more assertive towards others, not me, Naeem responded, laughing slightly. Whatever. Where is Zack? Zorian asked. Your friend already left, Ilsa said, glancing up from her clipboard for a moment. He said he had a court meeting scheduled soon, and couldn't wait for you to wake up. He said you already know how to contact him, Kale added. Zorian mostly stayed out of the whole thing. He trusted Zack to know what he was doing. He claimed he didn't need any help with this, and he had clearly been prepared for this a long time. Aren't you worried, at least a little? Akoja said, frowning. I mean, Tezen is a powerful man, and he surely knows you and Zack are friends. What if he decides to get back at him by going after you? Zorian smiled slightly. He found it interesting how pretty much none of their classmates thought Zack was lying about his accusations. He had expected that at least some of them would have thought Zack was making things up, but even Akoja, who definitely wasn't a fan of Zack, absolutely believed him when he publicly stated Tezen had robbed him of his family legacy. I'm not worried, Zorian said. This is the worst time to try and attack people in Scioria. The whole city is crawling with soldiers and investigators. Tezen would have to be mad to go after me right now. This was not entirely true, of course. Tezen had already tried to send people to scout Amaya's house and see if they could ambush him when he left the place, but these people had simply vanished into thin air before their mission was done. After that, Zack's caretaker hadn't bothered sending anyone else. Indeed, Ilsa said. Plus, I had the academy secure this house with additional wards, since we are effectively using it as a makeshift classroom. Anyone trying to infiltrate the place is in for an unpleasant surprise. And with that, I propose we start our usual lesson now. As you can imagine, an alteration expert like me is in high demand during this time of reconstruction, so I can only spare so much time here. Everyone immediately gave their assent for the idea, some more enthusiastically than others, after which Ilsa started giving short demonstrations to the gathered students. Even Kiriel, Nachka, and Kana paid close attention when Ilsa was casting spells, not having many opportunities to witness magic spells like this in their daily lives. The academy was temporarily closed. It had been closed for a month now, ever since the failed invasion. Not only had many sections of the academy been damaged in the attack, but most of the teachers had been recruited by the city to help deal with the aftermath as well. The place was scheduled to reopen in a week or so, if only to stop angry parents from demanding the money they had paid for attendance fees back, but for now, the student body was told to simply wait. A large number of students did just that, treating the whole thing as a sort of vacation, but not everyone was willing to simply waste a whole month or more when they had already paid to learn how to do magic. These students self-organized into study groups and continued their education on their own. Zorian was one of the people leading the charge on such things, at least when it came to his own class. He knew there were at least a handful of people in there that were serious about becoming a proper mage, and finding a study group that was not just an excuse to play cards every other night or some egoist's attempt to gather underlings was bound to be hard. This sort of initiative was admittedly not something Zorian was used to, and he had been absent from classes for most of the previous month, so his announcement that he was starting a study group had definitely raised some eyebrows. However, the fact that he had managed to talk Ilsa and some of the other teachers into occasionally giving demonstrations and lectures, something few others could boast about, made others more willing to trust him. The fact that Koja had decided to give up on her own study group in favor of choosing his own probably helped too. Koja was well known for her serious attitude and work ethic. If she was willing to join Zorian's group, he probably wasn't just messing around. He even got quite a few requests from older students and students from other classes about joining the group, though Zorian had to refuse most of them due to time constraints. He didn't want to spend most of his time teaching people and managing groups. It just wasn't something he was seriously interested in. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong with this spell," Kale complained. Zorian glanced at the Morlock and at the open book where the spell was detailed. "You're not doing anything wrong," Zorian told him. "You're casting the spell perfectly. Your shaping skills simply aren't good enough to pull it off. I can show you some more shaping exercises if you want." "Great," Kale mumbled. "More shaping exercises. You really remind me of that Svim guy you occasionally bring here to teach us." "That guy is his mentor, so it kind of makes sense," Capriva said. "Based on what I heard about the guy, you kind of have to go all the way with your shaping skills if you're assigned to him." "As if Zorian is suffering here," Edwin grumbled. He was, like Zorian, one of the people who had been assigned to Svim against his will, and still hadn't gotten over it. Probably because he really only cared about magic if it could help him with golem making, and shaping skills weren't high on the list of requisites for that. He's probably the only guy in the history of our academy that likes the guy and what he's teaching. You'd be surprised to know how many people speak highly of Mr. Chow's teaching skills, Ilsa remarked with a teasing smile. Though most people don't appreciate his genius, there are always one or two students that have what it takes to thrive under his tutelage. He didn't keep his job at the academy all these years for nothing, you know. We understand he's good at what he does, but does he really have to be so mean about it?" Kiana said, pouting. "The last time he was here he said my shaping skills are completely inadequate. I'm pretty sure my shaping skills are average at worst. Actually, they're very much above average now, and it's almost entirely due to Svim pushing you further and further every time he comes here," Zorian pointed out. "Teacher's pet," Kiana accused him with a huff. He was pretty sure Kiana was coming here only because Rainey was too, not because she was honestly so dedicated to improving her magic skills, but to her credit, she really did try to keep up with the rest of the group, unwilling to be left behind. Thus, whenever Svim criticized her and pushed her to try for more, she reluctantly did her best to rise to the challenge. She didn't appreciate it right now, but Zorian was sure she would eventually understand that Svim was doing her a huge favor. Most people had to pay a fortune to get personal instructions from an archmage. After a while, Ilsa excused herself and left. The group continued interacting and helping each other for a while after that, but eventually people started leaving and the group was becoming smaller. The table, so crowded and busy earlier in the morning, started to clear up and fall silent. In the end, the only ones left sitting there were Zorian and Rainey. Zorian had originally wanted to leave as well, but he could see from the glances Rainey was sending him and the emotions radiating off of her that she wanted to talk to him, so he remained patient and stayed in his seat. The invasion had been thwarted. Panicseth remained sealed. There was no more urgent danger constantly occupying his attention. He could finally waste an hour or two of his life and not feel bad about it in the back of his head. I just realized it's been a whole month, and I never thanked you for helping me find my little brother, Rainey eventually said, her tone hesitant. Zorian didn't know what to say to that. Since she hadn't mentioned any of this in all this time, he kind of figured she wanted to pretend the whole thing never happened. Sorry, she said, fiddling with her hands awkwardly. I know this is very late and dash. I don't hold it against you, Zorian assured her. I didn't do much, really. I just put you in contact with the right people. You did the rest, by organizing the other shifters into a rescue mission. You already heard about that? She asked, surprised. Then she shook her head. Wait, of course you heard about that, what am I even saying? After what I've seen that evening, it would be a bigger surprise if you didn't know anything about what happened. I hear you rescued your brother successfully, Zorian remarked. The cat shifters and pigeon shifters rescued my brother successfully, she corrected him. I just helped the police contact them and talk them into helping me. Then I just stood by the side and waited to see if they would succeed. Though yes, the newspapers have been crediting me for the whole thing. The city police insisted I should be the public face of the whole operation. I don't really understand it. What was there to understand? She was a beautiful teenage girl with an emotional story of trying to save her little brother. The police probably didn't want to release details about what was really going on before Eldamar's forces finished their investigation, and this was a nice way of distracting the public. Plus, it was a story with a happy ending, and Eldamar really loved pushing those to the forefront right now. He didn't say that out loud, of course. I'm pretty sure talking those two groups of shifters into cooperating wasn't easy at all, so don't put yourself down so much, Zorian told her. That aside, I get the feeling you're not really mentioning this because you're bothered by the newspaper exposure. What's got you so depressed? I'm not depressed, it's just my family has invited me to come back home, she admitted with a sigh. Ah, Zorian nodded. He paused for a second, considering. Is this a problem? You were instrumental in saving your younger brother, no? They should give you a hero's welcome. They might, she admitted. Or maybe they'll accuse me of overstepping my boundaries when I promised our tribes help in exchange for help in the rescue mission. I really don't know what's going to happen when I get there, and it scares me. Zorian was silent. I don't know why I'm telling you this, she admitted after a while. It's not like I expect you to help. You've done more than enough already. I guess I just wanted to complain to someone other than Kiana for a change. She's getting a little annoyed with me lately, I think. She thinks being praised in the newspapers is great, and that I'm being a baby. The newspapers are using you as a distraction and would turn on you in a second if it suited their purposes, so it's good you're not letting it get to your head, Zorian remarked. Still, I don't think you need to worry. I bet your family also doesn't know what's going to happen when you get there. They probably just want to see where they stand with you, since you surprised them so badly. Further conversation was interrupted by a large buzzing sound from a stone disc tied around Zorian's waist. Zorian glanced at it, somewhat annoyed. It was a communication device House Aope had given him so they could contact him, though Zorian hardly thought it deserved to be called a device. It was just a stone that vibrated when told to buy a second stone the Aope were in possession of, and did nothing else. Rather than convey useful information, the stone disc merely told him that House Aope representatives wanted to see him as soon as possible. He badly wanted to make real communication stones for this kind of use, something small and discreet and capable of facilitating actual two-way telepathy between holders, but doing that would be extremely suspicious and attention-grabbing. I'm going to have to cut this meeting short, he told Rainey. The Arania? Rainey guessed. Zorian nodded. I still can't believe that's what you've been doing this past month. You've been absent from classes, Rainey said. Learning mind magic from giant underground spiders. There was no other way, Zorian said. My empathy was running out of control and they were the first ones to realize what was happening, and stepped up to help me. I'm really grateful for their help. Sadly, although Zack and Zorian had been successful in keeping their involvement in the invasion itself a secret, there was no way to keep Zorian's involvement with the Arania a secret. This was because the Sciorian web had no way of hiding itself from Eldamar's authorities in the wake of the invasion, and asked Zorian to help them broker some kind of agreement with the city authorities. A hard task, and one that had given Zorian many headaches during this past month, but thankfully they had the support of noble House Aope in this endeavor. It would have probably been an impossible task, otherwise. Zorian might be a mastermind mage, but there was no way he could compel the entire royal bureaucracy to acknowledge a group of scary telepathic spiders as an ally against their will. Nor would he want to be that forceful, even if it were within his power. Sadly, this also meant that knowledge of Zorian's innate mind magic was gradually becoming more common. People thought he was a complete beginner at mind magic, yes, but he had already noticed mages starting to raise their mental shields when he was around, and his empathy told him some people were scared of him on sight. He dreaded to think what would happen if the full extent of his abilities became known. Well, said Rainey. Don't let me keep you from your duties. I should really get going as well. I guess I won't be seeing you in our group meetings, then. Zorian guessed. Yes, that was the other thing I wanted to tell you. I knew I was forgetting something, Rainey said. I'll be traveling home tomorrow, and I will probably stay there until the academy reopens. We'll see each other in class, then, Zorian said. Hopefully, she agreed. The two of them then each left their own way, and the kitchen was once again empty and quiet. But not for long. Things were always lively at Amaya's place these days. Though it was awful to even think so, Akoja had to say that this invasion business was the best thing that had happened to her in quite a while. She always felt guilty whenever the thought occurred to her. So many people had died, lost their homes, or lost their jobs when their workshops got destroyed, she should really feel sorry for them. And she did. She really did. But it was also an undeniable fact that the immediate aftermath had breathed new purpose into her life, giving her both the clarity about what she wanted in life and opportunities for advancements that she would have otherwise missed. In the month leading up to the attack of the city, she was lost, and more than a little bitter. She was putting so much work into her studies, into being a class representative and a model student, yet she felt it was all for naught. 2 years of hard work had not given her any special position or advanced opportunities, it only made other students resent her and look down on her. Sometimes, when she sat alone in her dorm room, she couldn't help but wonder if she was just wasting her time. Then the attack happened, and it was terrifying. She had only seen a fraction of the fighting, but what she had seen made her feel like a powerless ant, completely at the mercy of greater forces that could sweep her up without really trying. When the dust had settled and Akoja looked at the shattered remains of her old dorm, all of her belongings destroyed, she did not feel anger or despair at the money she had lost or the time and effort she would have to spend to replace it all. Instead, she felt a fire ignite within her, urging her to throw herself into her studies and make sure this kind of thing couldn't happen ever again. When war came for her again, she wanted to be ready. And war was definitely coming. Everyone knew it. Akoja wasn't the most avid follower of news, but she had read enough newspaper articles and listened to enough rumors to know that Eldamar was definitely going to launch a punitive expedition at Ulquin Ibesa in the coming months. Even though it risked leaving Eldamar vulnerable to opportunistic attacks by Falcrinia and Sulamnon, pride wouldn't allow Eldamar to swallow its anger and let this go. The only thing people were unsure of was how big the retaliation would really be, and how far Eldamar was willing to go to avenge Scioria. In any case, if Akoja had been on her own, perhaps her newfound drive would have eventually petered out in the coming weeks, and she would have once again begun questioning herself. A lot of people were fleeing the city these days, especially students like her and workers who otherwise lived elsewhere and only came to Scioria to make money. A couple of other girls from Corsa she occasionally talked to had already transferred themselves to other academies elsewhere in the kingdom, their parents having been spooked by the attack and fearful another one would follow in the wake of the first. It was, after all, still unclear how Okwin Ibesa had been able to strike so deep into Eldamar territory, so who was to say it couldn't happen again? Akoja's parents had also wanted to transfer her elsewhere, but she had refused. Cyoria may be dangerous, but she had to stay. Because Zorian was here. It wasn't just because she had a crush on him either. She talked to people, and it was obvious that the study group he had organized was the best one currently out there. He had teachers and even outside mages occasionally coming to provide lessons, which only one other study group had managed to do, and he himself was clearly very skilled for his age. He had an uncanny ability to notice the problems people were having, and how to fix them. Akoja had compared her progress during this past month with two other girls that had paid considerable money in order to be allowed in one of the better study groups, and was shocked to realize she was handily beating them. The comparison wasn't even close. But this new Zorian made her question if she really knew the guy. He was more skilled and well-connected than she imagined him to be, and apparently even had innate mind magic ability to draw upon. So unfair. Why didn't she have a famous older brother and a secret bloodline? How was a normal girl like her even supposed to compete with that? But, she eventually decided, it didn't matter. Maybe her reasons for liking him were kind of misguided, but she still liked him regardless. And he was helping her get better. So she had to stay in the city. It would have been better if she hadn't stated it quite like that in the letter she had sent to her parents, though, because now they wanted to meet him. She knew her father he was definitely going to come over to Cyoria and confront Zorian on his own if she didn't manage to defuse the situation. Hopefully her last letter had reached them in time. Still, that was thankfully a concern for another day. Today, she was simply going shopping around the city with Capriva and Kale. All of her possessions had gotten destroyed in the invasion, after all, and she still hadn't had the chance to fully replenish them. Capriva was in a similar position to her, while Kale had apparently never had much stuff to begin with, as he had previously tended to constantly move around with Kana before coming to Cyoria, meaning until recently he owned very few things. Neither Capriva nor Kale was someone that Akoja would have wanted to associate with before the attack. Capriva came from a family of criminals, and Kale was a Morlock. Neither were people that a lady in good standing such as her would want to be seen with. However, strange times made for strange bedfellows. She had gotten to know these two over the past month, and they were all right, she supposed. Wait, so Zack bought you an entire lab? Capriva asked incredulously, looking at Kale. Honestly, you were scaring me and the other tenants as well, Capriva told him. Alchemy experiments shouldn't be done right below where other people are sleeping, even if the place is warded. Still, I'm surprised Zack was willing to shell out that kind of money for you. Even if it's been damaged in the attack, a building in Cyoria is still bound to be expensive as hell. A lot of people are selling property in Cyoria these days, Kale noted. Prices have dropped considerably. I'm pretty sure it was Zorian who talked Zack into spending money on this, Akoja said, sighing internally. She didn't like Zack. His recent reveal that his caretaker was stealing from him made Akoja feel sorry for him a little, but only a little. He was the embodiment of everything she was jealous of when it came to Eldamar's mage elite, except he didn't even try to make something of himself, content to live the life of a clown and a wastrel. She hoped Zorian, as his new friend, would help him clean up his act, but she wasn't holding her breath. Probably, Kale agreed. I was surprised when people told me they only became friends over the summer holidays. They seem like they have been friends their whole lives. Yeah, I first thought Zorian was just taking advantage of Zack to get at his money, but these days I kind of doubt it, Capriva said. He has a serious source of cash of his own, I can tell. From what? Akoja asked curiously. How could a teenager like Zorian have serious money unless someone gifted it to him? Sales, Capriva said. I don't know what he's selling, but it must be pretty rare and profitable because people have been asking about him a lot, trying to get in contact with him. You mean in your circles? Akoja asked worriedly. Yes, in my circles, Capriva laughed at her. I'm sorry, but your crush isn't as clean as you imagine him to be. I don't know what you're talking about, Akoja told her quickly. We're just colleagues. Yeah, sure, Capriva rolled her eyes at her. So, I hate to interrupt your conversation, Kale suddenly said, but have any of you recently found a book or a collection of notes, maybe in your room? What kind of book? Akoja asked curiously. What was the boy even talking about? A book you've definitely never bought, and notebooks you've definitely never written, Kale said. Just sitting there on your nightstand, full of magical secrets that seem almost as if they were specifically tailored to you, and you alone. There was a second of silence as the two girls processed this statement. That seriously happened? Capriva asked incredulously. You found a book and some notebooks in your room dash. My locked room, Kale clarified. My locked and warded room that Ilsa later confirmed hadn't been broken into. And they contained a gift of magic specifically tailored for you. Capriva finished. You damn Morlock bastard, first you have a rich guy buy you your very own alchemy lab, and now this? How are you so damn lucky? The most disturbing thing, Kale said hesitantly, ignoring Capriva's outburst, is that some of the passages use the exact same wording, codes, and symbols that I do. This happens over and over again, to the point I don't think anyone can reasonably fake it. What are you saying? Akoja asked, not really understanding. It's my writing style, Kale said. I have several years' worth of alchemical and medical research, seemingly made by my hand, but no memory of writing any of it. And I don't know what to think about that. The two girls stayed silent. Their first instinct was to deny the idea as completely absurd. But these were mad times they were living in, and nothing was too absurd to fully dismiss. So they just stayed silent and filed the topic in the back of their heads, put aside but not forgotten, and went about their shopping in peace. Eliur Inid was the special investigator sent by the Crown of Eldamar to find out what exactly had happened in Scioria on the day of the attack, and he was not happy. Not happy at all. It wasn't just about a foreign power having the ability to strike deep into Eldamar's territory at their leisure. It wasn't just about the rampant betrayal among Eldamar's highest ranks that had allowed this attack to progress as far as it had. It was about the fact that someone had stopped the invasion and saved the city, and it wasn't anyone that Eliur recognized. Regular people often talked about mysterious organizations and enigmatic hermits moving about in the shadows of polite society, but the truth was that organizations that held real power and powerful individuals didn't spring out of nowhere. It took a lot of resources and connections to raise a top-tier mage, and even more to build an organization around one. By the time these rising powers were able and willing to exert their will and influence on the world around them, people like Eliur will have already noticed them and learned who they were. When mysterious events like the one that had happened a month ago in Scioria occurred, investigators were often unsure who exactly was behind them, especially if the perpetrators had been thorough and erased all the evidence. However, they always had an idea who could have done it, even if they had no proof or couldn't narrow down all the possibilities to one actor. At the moment, though, Eliur had plenty of evidence. He had witness testimonials, magical recordings, field reports from soldiers and mages that had been present when the attack took place, and even material evidence. And all of it was telling him that this couldn't have been done by anyone he knew about. Even more disturbingly, even after he had consulted with some of his foreign sources, he was no closer to finding a likely candidate. No one had any idea who could have done this. It was as if these saviors had materialized straight out of thin air, and vanished just as suddenly afterwards. Eliur stood in front of the wreckage of a large golem, hands folded behind his back. To his left, two researchers shuffled uncomfortably in place, hesitating to speak. Well, he asked them impatiently. Have you identified the maker of this thing? None of the known golem makers produced this, Mr. Inid, one of the researchers said after fumbling with his clothes a little and clearing his throat. Although the animation core has been shattered beyond recovery, enough of it survived that we have been able to make some startling discoveries. We are very sure the established golem makers would never make such a thing. Why is that? Eerie asked, suddenly curious. Honestly, he thought the golem wreckage would bring him no answers, so this was a pleasant surprise. The spell formulas inscribed on the animation core are completely unprotected, the other researcher said. No codes, no misdirection, no attempts to shroud the method of creation at all. Usually artificers spend almost as much time trying to hide how they made something as they do making designs for it. Golem makers especially so. But there is no evidence of that here. Whoever made this thing cared only about pure efficiency. Are you saying we could potentially replicate this thing? Eerie asked. Now wouldn't that be something? He had heard reports about how good these golems were, and it was apparently something on a whole different level from your typical combat golem. If they could duplicate one of these, then this would be a huge gain. When Eerie saw the two researchers share a knowing look with each other, however, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The issue is that the animation core has been totally shattered, and some parts of the spell formula inscribed on it are missing. Even after we compared it with the remains of other golem wrecks we have recovered from the city, we are still missing about 10% of the design. Just 10%. And you can't fill in the blanks? Eerie asked curiously. Heavens no, the first researcher said, bursting into laughter. The design for this thing is one of the most complex things I've ever seen in my life. Everything slots together perfectly, and even the slightest mistake would make everything collapse on itself. And considering how expensive the materials for the construction of this kind of core are, experimentation would be hellishly expensive. Never mind 10%, even a 1% gap would make this design completely unviable. Unless we manage to find an intact golem, the only thing this is useful for is for serving as inspiration. Alright, Eerie said, turning away from the wreckage and walking off. The two researchers quickly followed after him. What is this about some mysterious books that I'm hearing about? Ah, you mean the mysterious gifts some people have been getting? The second researcher asked. Eerie nodded. We have only managed to recover a handful of them from the people they were given to. Rumors of us confiscating them have spread among people fast, as has the fact they are of no danger to the recipient, so people no longer report them to us. But from the few we have in our hands, they seem to be full of novel magic specifically tailored for the recipient. If I may make a suggestion, it might be prudent to return the books we've confiscated to the people they were given to, the first researcher said. We've already copied the contents, and it might motivate people to let us take a look at the stuff they're currently hiding if they see they're eventually going to get it back. I'll think about it, Eerie said, not thinking much of it. He didn't like the idea of someone handing over magical secrets to people like that, not at all. Plus, he had suspicions their mysterious saviors were behind this as well. Those gifts were evidence and he was keeping them, at least so long as his investigation lasted. Infuriatingly, said investigation was encountering a lot of unexpected obstacles. The Triumvirate Church had clearly been heavily involved in the battle. There was a giant angel battling a dragon mage in the skies of Scioria, for heaven's sake. But they refused to let him interrogate the priesthood involved, and the crown was reluctant to offend them. The church had been spectacularly successful recently, providing valuable help and information on necromancer hideouts, demon summoner bases, and some of the more awful criminal groups. Eerie had no idea how they had gotten so much critical information about Eldamar's criminal underbelly, but they had, and this unfortunately meant they currently had an upper hand over him and his investigation. At the same time, Eerie was having trouble keeping the funds and manpower for the investigation going. Eldamar's attention had been stretched very thin lately. They had an invasion of Ulquin Abasa to organize, complicated heavily by the fact the Abasans had somehow managed to take over Fort Oriclo without Eldamar realizing it. They were throwing a lot of money and manpower at Scioria in order to get the city up and running again, in order to make a show of strength and lift up morale, and these efforts often clashed greatly with Elair's own investigation into what had transpired there. Solimnon, Falcrinia, and even many smaller countries were stirring, trying to see just how badly the kingdom had been hurt and whether they could fish in troubled waters while Eldamar's forces were distracted elsewhere. And finally, there was that permanent gate that linked Eldamar with the jungles of Koth, which had everyone and their mother excited about the incredible opportunities this presented. The gate was clearly related to the Abasan invasion somehow, but Elair and his men were not allowed to examine it closely for fear that they would destroy the precious, irreplaceable, intercontinental gate with their tampering. Bah! And then his superiors complain he has no results. Of course he had no results. Just what did they expect? And they constantly keep taking his money and resources, and don't let him touch things or question people. But Elair was patient. His foes may have won this round, but he knew what to look for now, and everyone slipped up sooner or later. It may take a year, or even a decade, but they were bound to make a mistake. And when they did, Elair would be there, and he would be ready. Daimen Kaczynski was having a stressful, but very exciting month. From the day he had woken up in an unknown room in Scioria with an entire month of his life missing from his memory, it had been a non-stop wild ride of crazy reveals and maddening complications. It was annoying, but truth be told, he kind of enjoyed it. A safe, boring life had never been something he coveted. He somewhat resented his little brother for wiping away a month of his life to save his friend, but he understood. He would have done the same in his place, probably. At the very least, Daimen could safely say he had profited handsomely from this whole time loop business. Not only had Zorian gifted him a veritable treasure of research and notes he had apparently made for himself during this time loop, but he also indirectly allowed the Terramachula to seize the permanent gate linking Koth to Eldamar. A permanent intercontinental gate. The sheer possibilities of that thing were breathtaking to consider. Eldamar's forces quickly moved to secure their side of the gate, but they didn't try to push through it to monopolize the whole thing. It would be too easy for the Terramachula to simply destroy their side of gate back in Koth, and thus ruin this whole thing for everyone. Thus, the kingdom of Eldamar and the Terramachula now found themselves in possession of a permanent dimensional link between continents. Both sides were positively salivating at the potential profits and other benefits involved, and since Daimen was closely connected to both of said parties, it was often up to him to act as a bridge and negotiator between these two sides. And then there was Zorian, his little brother, the time traveler. Well, it wasn't real time travel, but it may as well be, from Damon's point of view. He had beheld a doomed future, and then he had traveled back to their own world to stop it, and save as many people as possible in the process. And in order to pull it off, he'd had to kill the original Zorian, and steal his body for his own uses. Daimen would have liked to say he was conflicted about this information. Zorian was right, in a very real sense, his little brother had been murdered and replaced by an imposter. He should have been outraged. He should have been deeply disturbed by the implications, just like Zorian himself clearly was. But he wasn't. Maybe it was because the whole situation was so utterly ridiculous and it was hard to really know what to feel. Maybe it was because, by Zorian's own admission, the original Zorian hated him something fierce. Or perhaps it was because he damn well knew that if he had been in Zorian's position, he would have murdered his own original without a shred of hesitation and thought nothing of it. All he knew was that he'd simply told Zorian that everything would be fine, and that he shouldn't worry about it. He had only done what he had to. Maybe it was just Daimen imagining things, but he thought he'd seen a small flash of gratitude in his brother's eyes when he said that. He hadn't expected the big bad time traveler to actually care about his opinion that much. Interesting. Now, here they were, every Kaczynski sibling gathered together. Daimen, Zorian, Kiriel, and Fortov were all standing next to one another at Scioria's train station, waiting for the next train to arrive. Their parents were coming to Scioria. It was kind of funny, actually. If his parents had arrived to Koth as planned, they could have been here way earlier. Daimen would have arranged for them to step through the brand new interdimensional gate linking Koth to Eldamar, and they would have been home before you knew it. Alas, they'd actually heard about the attack on Scioria when they had almost reached their destination, and decided to immediately switch ships and turn back. As a consequence, they had spent almost an entire month in transit before they were able to return to Eldamar. Sighing inwardly, Daimen noticed that no one except him looked actually excited about that fact. Zorian looked bored and disinterested, clearly intending to just get this over with as quickly and painlessly as possible. Fortov seemed nervous and unsure how to behave. His other younger brother had been acting strangely ever since Daimen had evacuated him from Scioria along with Kiriel, and Daimen had no idea what was going on in his head at the moment, but he clearly wasn't looking forward to this meeting. As for Kiriel, she was playing around with the fancy snow globe Zorian had bought for her while they had been waiting for the train to arrive, but Daimen could see she was extremely nervous under this disinterested facade. He should have brought Orisa with him, he lamented. He had originally left her behind because he didn't want to provoke his parents in this particular meeting, since they were bound to be extremely distraught already, but now he wondered if her presence would have been a positive thing instead. It was too late for such regrets, however. The train soon entered the station and began to disembark. It wasn't long before Daimen spotted their parents. They weren't carrying much in the way of luggage. Daimen winced internally. It made sense, since they must have dropped off most of their stuff when they had stopped by in Siren. Still, the fact they were carrying practically nothing meant they expected this to be a very short visit. This was probably going to get unpleasant. Not long after Daimen had spotted their parents, they also spotted him. The two groups quickly made their way towards one another. For heaven's sake, what are you children still doing in this city? Mother complained the moment they were within earshot. Mother Daimen tried futilely. The whole city was under siege until recently. The academy is closed. Why aren't you all back in Siren already? She continued. Father was totally silent, simply studying each of them in turn. Once he saw that all of them were unharmed, he seemed to relax a little. Most wouldn't be able to tell, but Daimen was the closest to father out of all the Kaczynski siblings, and could read his little tics pretty well by this point. Never mind, I'll help you pack your bags and we'll be home by tomorrow. What? No, we won't, Zorian simply told her in a bored tone of voice. Zorian, please let me handle this, Daimen urged in a low tone of voice. Father gave Zorian a penetrating look for his statement, a gesture that would usually instantly put Zorian on the defensive, but of course, this time traveler Zorian was not bothered by it in the slightest. Zorian didn't talk about family all that much, but Daimen got the notion that Zorian had barely interacted with mother and father during the time loop. The two were practically strangers to him, and it showed in his attitude towards them. That, more than the fact he'd had to kill his original self to be here, greatly disturbed Daimen. You seem to have grown some spine in the short time you've been here, father remarked, still staring intently at Zorian. He didn't say whether this was good or bad, but Daimen knew he thought it was both. He liked when his sons had a firm, decisive attitude, but he also didn't tolerate disrespect towards himself and mother. Zorian is just dedicated to his studies, Daimen hurriedly explained, shooting Zorian a quick look to shut him up. Just because the academy is closed doesn't mean we're all doing nothing. Zorian is organizing a study group for his class so they can continue studying on their own in private. He even got some of the teachers to help him out. But Kiriel mother tried. I like it here. Kiriel immediately exclaimed. I have friends here and everything. But I'm not. Kiriel protested. Quiet, mother barked at her. Kiriel immediately shrank back. Out of the corner of his eye, Daimen could see Zorian's mood immediately worsen. Out of all of them here, Kiriel was the one Zorian cared about the most. Daimen was pretty sure his little brother would be willing to make an enemy out of his whole family for Kiriel's sake, which was more than a little disturbing. Kiriel was a cute kid, but she could be a massive brat sometimes. Anyway, if Zorian is as busy as you say, what about Fortov? Mother continued. He could have taken Kiriel back to Siren just fine, yes. Yes, he's already a failed student wasting his time and our money here, Father agreed. Why not have him be useful for a change? You. Fortov protested, visibly outraged. Am I wrong? Father challenged. Why even send me back here if that's what you think about me? Fortov protested. Please, Father, Daimen urged. Look, no, Fortov had some issues with his studies lately. Father scoffed. Mother sighed. Fortov looked furious, and very bitter. But I have been giving him some help lately, and I'm sure he'll turn the situation around, Daimen said. He had promised to take care of Fortov back in the time loop, apparently. Although Daimen didn't remember it, he had to admit Fortov needed his help. Certainly Zorian made it clear he didn't want to do anything with the guy. Apparently, despite having lived in the same city for years, Zorian had never bothered to interact with his brother and figure out how to help him. For all his newfound maturity, this new Zorian still had clear traces of his old self. He sure could nurse a grudge, for instance. And for how long will that last? Father challenged. You'll be back in Koth soon, I imagine, and then he'll be back on his own. I doubt 1 month will make that much difference. Actually, I'm going to be around much more often than I usually am, Daimen said. Haven't you wondered how I got here before you? Father and Mother looked at each other. Well, I thought maybe you used the teleport network, tried Mother. Daimen shook his head with a slight smile. Mother, Father, I want to show you something. We can go and meet my fiancée and her family now, if you're willing. It's what you were traveling to Koth for, after all. What? They came here with you? Mother asked incredulously. Daimen understood her disbelief. A single individual like him could conceivably cross large distances on a whim, but a small group of people was a much bigger challenge. You'll see, Daimen said with a grin. Things are going to change a lot in the future, I think. Who knows, maybe even your family business might profit out of this. Thankfully, this was sufficiently interesting that it distracted Mother and Father from further questioning. He knew that sooner or later, Mother would realize that Zorian had already started teaching Kiriel magic behind her back and that her beloved daughter had been literally attacked by assassins during the invasion, if nothing else because Kiriel was sure to blurt it out at some point, and that once she did, there would be hell to pay. For now, though, the crisis had been over. Zorian. Hey! Zorian. Daimen looked at the person calling out to his brother and saw a chubby boy with a happy smile on his face hurrying over. An older, well-dressed man with a mustache followed behind him at a more sedate pace. Probably the boy's father. The funny thing about this was that the boy clearly acted like he was Zorian's friend, but Daimen himself had never seen Zorian interact with him at all. That was interesting to say the least. Hey Zorian. I see you already got back, too, the boy said once he got closer. I never left, Ben, Zorian said politely. Oh, so they did know each other. By this point the boy's father also arrived, though he stayed silent behind the boy. He simply gave a small nod and quiet greeting to the gathered Kazinskis before waiting for his son to calm down. You never left. Man, you work too hard, the chubby boy said. I heard you got roped into being an ambassador for some giant spiders. You got to introduce me to them someday, man. Sounds like one hell of an experience. There was a long silence as all the Kazinski siblings looked incredibly uncomfortable. What? The boy said, realizing he made some kind of mistake. What did I say? Giant spiders? Mother repeated. Daimen couldn't help it. He sighed audibly this time. So much for averting disaster. As he walked through the streets of the city and observed the reconstruction efforts around him, Zorian couldn't help but feel satisfied with how things had been going lately. There were a few complications here and there, but the city was slowly beginning to recover, and neither Zack nor Zorian had been implicated in what had happened. The thanks for that partially went to Alanik, due to him running interference on their behalf in exchange for helping him clean up Eldamar of various threats, as well as Eldamar having its hands full with all kinds of problems these days, but mostly it was because they were currently complete unknowns to most people, so nobody even suspected they could have been involved. Zorian sincerely hoped that by the time they were forced to reveal some of their real skills, too much time will have passed, and people would not connect the dots linking them to the events that had taken place during the invasion. Sadly, his quiet enjoyment of the city was marred by the fact people kept giving him curious and occasionally fearful glances as he passed them, the crowds parting in front of him like he was diseased. Well, they probably weren't doing that because of him, specifically. Rather, it was because of the giant telepathic spider strutting around the city beside him. Spear of Resolve seemed completely unperturbed by the reception, however, and gave no indication this sort of behavior bothered her. If anything, she seemed immensely pleased with herself that she could walk through the city of Scioria in broad daylight without being immediately attacked, or met with screams and calls for help. This was already a victory for her and her web. The Urania hadn't been entirely accepted by the city authorities yet. Legally, they were still considered monsters that had no rights, and there was a portion of Eldamarian leadership that really wanted to just wipe them out or drive them out of the city. However, the Urania had quietly gathered a considerable amount of support in the city over the years, so there was also no shortage of people willing to argue on their behalf. More importantly, even the critics that considered them dangerous telepathic parasites had to admit they were instrumental in preventing the various threats from the lower reaches of the dungeon from menacing the city. Considering the amount of destruction and suffering Scioria had suffered recently, the last thing it needed was to go through a monster invasion too because some general couldn't tolerate the Urania living beneath the city. The opinion of regular citizens was, from what Zorian could understand, somewhat mixed. The Urania were said to have helped fight the invaders, which won them some goodwill, but they were also monsters, spiders, and mind mages. None of those three sounded good to the average citizen. Accordingly, when people saw Spear of Resolve walking down the street like she always belonged there, their reactions were mixed, to say the least. Thankfully both Zorian and Tinami were accompanying her on this stroll to make sure no incident occurred. Zorian was certain that Spear of Resolve was resourceful enough to evade any real conflict with frightened citizens, but it was best not to risk things. So how are the negotiations going? Zorian asked Spear of Resolve, not bothering to use telepathy for Tinami's sake. The Aope had managed to secure a magic exchange with the Urania, and Tinami was a part of that, but she wasn't psychic, and her advancement was slow. She wasn't good enough for casual telepathy yet. Somewhat disappointingly, Spear of Resolve admitted, using sound magic to speak out loud as well. We have managed to block any initiative to have us driven out of our homes, but it's unlikely we will get legal recognition anytime soon. That was always a little naive of you to expect, Tinami told her. The Aope usually preferred to employ older and more experienced people for these kinds of meetings, but Tinami was the designated heir of the house, and she was throwing her weight around to get personally involved in something that very much interested her. You're still too much of an unknown for people to trust you, regardless of your help with the invasion. Oh, I know that, Spear of Resolve assured her. I didn't expect a better outcome, so much as hope for it. I have already made the necessary preparations. The colony can retreat from Scioria on a moment's notice, if it becomes necessary. Where would you go, though? Tinami asked. I can't imagine there are that many places suitable for your kind. We would simply assault one of the smaller webs around the area and steal their home for ourselves, Spear of Resolve said blandly. The Uranian world is a rather brutal place, I'm afraid. Oh, Tinami lamely responded. I heard your academy is about to reopen soon, Spear of Resolve said, turning slightly towards Zorian before resuming her walk. So I'm told, Zorian said. He spotted Taven and her team in the distance, trailing after a large group of other mages, and gave her a small wave. She waved back, but didn't linger or try to talk to him, simply following after her group so she wouldn't slow them down. She looked happy, though. In the wake of the invasion, there was an urgent demand for combat mages, so she had plenty of job offers and opportunities to prove herself. If it doesn't start again soon, the parents that didn't get frightened by the attack will start pulling their children out of the academy out of concern they're not getting taught anything. He looked at Tinami, somewhat curious as to how she was handling that. She had never expressed any desire to join their study group, or any study group for that matter. Was she so focused on this Iranian business that she had no problems putting her education on hold for a month, or did she have some kind of alternate arrangements? My family has arranged private instruction for me, Tinami admitted, somehow guessing his thoughts. I mean, no offense to your study group and your efforts, but this seemed a better idea. She was probably right. As good as he wasn't really a teacher and he had a whole group to deal with anyway. Tinami probably would get far better results out of private instructors. It kind of made him wonder why her family had even sent her to the academy in the first place, if they could just hire a bunch of private instructors for her. Was it too expensive? Did they just want her to socialize with people? I have a favor to ask of you, then, Spear of Resolve told Zorian. I've made some arrangements with the academy to let Novelty attend a few of your classes as an observer. I'd like you to keep an eye on her and stop her from getting herself into more trouble than she can handle. Why would you do that? Zorian frowned. I know she wants to learn human magic, but do you have any idea how mundane and repetitive our classes are? She'll be bored out of her skull in 3 days, maximum. It would be better to just have her come to me for instruction. I did promise I would teach her, after all. No offense, Zorian, but you're just a beginner mage still, Tinami said, frowning. You're not really qualified to teach a member of a completely different species how to do magic. That kind of thing is best left for actual experts. Yeah, I meant I would teach her later, Zorian fumbled slightly. Years later, when I mature into a mage. Who is qualified to help her? That's what I meant. Tinami gave him a really strange look. It's a good thing for Novelty to receive a much-needed reality check from time to time, so I'm not really concerned about her being bored out of her mind there, Spear of Resolve said, ignoring their interaction. Besides, I didn't mean for this to become a regular thing. I just want to have the students see an Irania walking around and interact with them a bit. It's a publicity stunt more than anything. Oh, so this is kind of like what we're doing right now, Tinami said. After all, it wasn't like they had to have this conversation in the middle of a street where random people could see them. They could have just as easily met in a private room inside the Novita estate, or even inside one of the many AO properties, but Spear of Resolve insisted they had to do this way. Yes, exactly, Spear of Resolve said. I have to ask why Novelty? Tinami asked suddenly. Not that I dislike her or anything, but I get the notion that you're pushing her pretty hard, and I can't figure out why. She is not exactly someone I would pick for an ambassador if I had to choose. Surely you have Irania that are more solemn than her. Enthusiastic seeker of novelty is more suited for the role than you might think, Spear of Resolve said after a short pause. You have to understand that the number of Irania living beneath Scioria is not that great. We must hunt to survive, so we can't support large populations. Of the people I do have, many have no interest in learning how to interact with humans, or even downright look down on them. Ah. The Flickermine thing, Tinami said, sniffing disdainfully. Yes, that. The point is that I really don't have all that much to work with, and Novelty is one of the few Irania who is downright enthusiastic about going out into the city and meeting humans face to face. Besides, while her antics might not be exactly professional, I've noticed they put many humans at ease better than a solemn, respectful approach. They often perceive her as a harmless clown, or an innocent little girl, which never fails to amuse me. She's an adult Urania specializing in interactions with humans. She's far more dangerous to a human than your average, less excitable Urania. Oh. I didn't think of it like that, Tinami admitted. What Spear of Resolve didn't say, but what Zorian strongly suspected, was that she was pushing novelty partly because she knew Zorian liked her. It was clear to him that the Sciorian Web was determined to build a closer relationship with him and keep him as close to them as possible, so it made sense to have Novelty talk to him. After a few more circles around the center of the city, the three of them separated and went about their own business. Zorian never went home, however, instead choosing to continue wandering the city, lost in his own thoughts. He picked up a couple of newspapers as he walked, and idly flipped through them. As he expected, most of the news was still dedicated to the attack on the city, even a whole month after it happened. An article about the Solrotham warriors that had helped the defenders during the attack caught his eye, if only because of the detailed drawing of a flying sandworm hovering above the city. He remembered that the devil wasps had refused Zorian's offer of simply gating them back home to their ziggurat and had decided to instead have their giant flying sandworm pick them up and slowly fly them back to their continent. Some kind of power play, probably. Thankfully, no one in Eldamar had been in the mood to pick a fight with a giant flying sandworm, so they let them leave without incident. Leafing through the articles more thoroughly, he also found subtle clues that the people who had received his gifts had already started to make waves with the knowledge he provided them with. In all honesty, Zorian had yet to hand out even a fraction of the stuff he owed to people for their help. It would take him literal years to finish paying back his debts this way, but he would persist. In any case, he was glad people were starting to make use of the knowledge they had been given. It assured him he wasn't doing all that in vain. He had also started writing a book on mind magic, but that was still in its early stages, and nowhere near to completion. Publishing anything related to mind magic on a wide scale was going to be difficult, but he would find a way. Hours passed, and the night began to fall. Zorian still continued to wander the streets of the city, restless. Though he had no real emergency to worry about, it somehow felt wrong to him to just lay around and do nothing. He had spent so much time constantly on the move, constantly tackling one crisis after another, that he felt like he had to do something with himself, even if that something was basically wandering the city with no clear aim in sight. His mind wandered to the couple of issues he still hadn't dealt with. For instance, Princess. The giant divinely enhanced Hydra had survived her fight with Ogan's apprentice, and Zorian had no idea what he was going to do with her. There was no way to transfer ownership of her to Zack, so he was stuck with her. Thankfully, she was doing just fine for now, lazing around in the great northern forest, but he knew that couldn't continue forever. He had to figure out what to do with her one of these days. Another complication was the giant ironbeak flock. Zorian had simply released them into the northern wilderness when he had been checking up on Princess, thinking they would simply scatter and continue on with their own lives from now on. Instead, they decided to stick around Princess and now followed her around everywhere, helping her hunt and feeding on the remains of her prey when she had her fill. It made Princess far more noticeable and eye-catching than she would have otherwise been, and made the question of what to do with her all the more pressing. He also didn't know what to do about Merva. He had managed to get the Golem Colossus out of Scioria before the army could move in and confiscate him, but his precious construct was still completely non-functional and the place where he was storing him was not really as secure as he would have liked. Annoyingly, he was probably going to have to tolerate this state of affairs for quite a long time. Restoring Merva back into combat condition and making a properly secure place to house him in would both take a large amount of money, and money was annoyingly hard to get out of the time loop. There were no more invader caches and bank accounts to steal from, so unless he wanted to prey on innocent citizens he had to find other sources of funds, and vastly scale down his expenses. He had a bit of a problem, in all honesty. During the time loop he'd gotten into the habit of spending money like water, and though he was mindful of it after their victory, he still struggled to keep his expenses under control. He still had a sizable stash of funds to draw upon, but it was constantly getting smaller by the day. He had tried to get large sums of money by selling some of his creations, but that had drawn way more attention than he had thought it would, so he was forced to stop with that for the time being. The only thing he could do was, spend less. At least until he found a convenient way to make a lot of money without it making huge waves or being traced back to him. He stopped walking and looked at the full moon shining bright in the skies above. For some reason, the sight of the night sky, accompanied by the warm night air, helped put his mind at ease. "Well, Zorian, you wanted a normal life," he said out loud to himself, "now you're having money problems. What could be more normal than that?" "You said it, brother," an unknown man shouted at him from his left. It wasn't anyone Zorian knew, it was just some drunk that happened to be close by. Drunk enough to be spouting nonsense, but sober enough to make himself understood. "I too am completely penniless. I spent everything I had tonight and there is nothing wrong with that. What could be more normal than that? Yes indeed, yes indeed, yes indeed." Zorian sighed, and then turned in the direction of Amaya's house. He supposed it really was time to get some sleep. She had no name. She did not need one. She was a hunter and a mother, devoid of any higher purpose except for surviving, protecting her territory, and raising as many offspring as she could. But that was before. After her last feast, she had found herself imbued with greater purpose. The essence of her prey, the hated two legs that had provoked her again and again, had proven so sweet and so powerful. It filled her up, suffusing her in a way she had never experienced before, then filtered through her and settled inside her eggs. Her eggs were special now, she knew. The brood that would hatch out of them was going to be special too. She had always guarded her eggs and young diligently and with passion, only chasing them off when they grew too big and needy, but this time it was different. These eggs, and the young that would hatch from them, had to be guarded with her life. She would do anything to keep them safe. She would die for them if she had to. She was afraid. She wanted to go back, go up, return to the safety of higher hunting grounds, but the urge, her purpose was stronger. She had to survive. She had to protect her eggs. She had to go deeper. So despite her fears, despite what all her life experience was telling her, she stubbornly kept going deeper. Where her destiny awaited.